Have you ever heard something in the woods that knew your deepest secrets? I'm about to share 11 disturbing camping experiences that actually happened. Names and details are changed for privacy, but these stories are real. People were traumatized by what they encountered out there. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you alone? Hit subscribe to Bleak Fears for more true horror. Let's begin with our first tale. Rhett had been working in software development for 6 years, and the job had slowly consumed every corner of his life. The endless meetings, the constant emails, the pressure to always be available had left him feeling hollowed out and exhausted. He needed to get away from everything, from the notifications and the screens and the relentless pace of Portland. That's why he packed his gear and drove 3 hours to Olympic National Park in late September. He wanted solitude, the kind you can only find deep in the backcountry, where cell service disappears and the only sounds are wind through pine trees and your own footsteps on the trail. He'd been backpacking before, but never truly alone like this. There was something both terrifying and liberating about the idea of being completely isolated for 3 days. No safety net. No one to rely on but himself. The hike in took most of the afternoon. Rhett followed a moderately trafficked trail for the first few miles, before branching off onto a narrower path that led deeper into the dense pine forest. The trees here were massive, their trunks thick and ancient, their canopy so dense that even in late afternoon the light filtering through had a greenish quality to it. The air smelled clean and sharp, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. By the time he reached his chosen campsite, a small clearing near a trickling creek, his shoulders ached from the pack and his legs felt rubbery. But there was a satisfaction in it, in the physical exhaustion that came from actually doing something real instead of just sitting at a desk pretending to be productive. He set up his tent with practiced efficiency, staking it down securely and checking twice that everything was properly tightened. The temperature was already dropping as the sun began its descent, and he knew it would get cold once darkness fell. He gathered firewood, filtered water from the creek, and made a simple dinner of dehydrated camping food that tasted better than it had any right to after a long day of hiking. As he ate, he watched the light fade from the forest, the shadows growing longer and deeper until the spaces between the trees became impenetrable walls of darkness. He'd brought a book, but found he couldn't focus on it. Instead, he just sat by his small fire, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The creek burbled softly. The fire crackled and popped. The first night passed without incident. Rhett slept heavily, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after genuine physical exertion. He woke at dawn feeling more rested than he had in months, made coffee with his camp stove, and spent the day exploring the area around his campsite. He found a ridge with a view that stretched for miles, nothing but forest and mountains in every direction. He saw a black bear from a safe distance, watched it amble through a berry patch, completely unconcerned with his presence. He returned to camp in the late afternoon, made dinner, and sat by another fire as darkness claimed the forest once again. It was around 2 a.m. when he first heard it. Rhett had always been a light sleeper when camping, aware on some primitive level that he was vulnerable in a thin nylon tent in the middle of nowhere. So when the sound came, it pulled him instantly from sleep into that state of hyper-alert awareness where every sense feels amplified. At first, he thought it was wind, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush, but then he recognized it for what it was. Someone was whistling. The sound was clear and melodic, a simple tune carried through the still night air. It seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond his tent, out in the darkness of the forest. Rhett's first reaction was confusion more than fear. Who else would be out here at this hour? He hadn't seen another person since he'd left the main trail yesterday afternoon. The nearest established campsite was miles away. He lay perfectly still in his sleeping bag, listening. The whistling continued, unhurried and calm. It had a strange quality to it, perfectly pitched and oddly familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. Then, as he listened more carefully, he realized the sound was moving, not quickly, but deliberately. The whistler was circling his campsite. That's when the fear started to creep in. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone deliberately walking circles around his tent in the middle of the night, whistling as they went. Rhett's mind raced through possibilities. Another camper playing a prank. That seemed unlikely given how remote this location was. A ranger checking on him? No, they wouldn't do this. Someone with bad intentions? His heart rate kicked up at that thought. He was alone out here, miles from help, with no cell service and no weapon beyond a small knife he used for cutting rope and opening packages. The whistling completed one full circuit of his campsite and started another. It stayed roughly the same distance away, maybe 20 or 30 feet from his tent, moving at a walking pace through the darkness. Rhett found himself holding his breath, straining to hear any other sounds. Footsteps, breathing, anything that would give him more information about who or what was out there. But there was only the whistling, clear and steady and impossibly calm. Minutes passed. The circles continued. Rhett's rational mind tried to find explanations while his primitive hindbrain screamed at him that something was deeply wrong. Then, with a jolt of recognition that felt like ice water in his veins, he placed the melody. It was a song his grandmother used to whistle when he was a child. She'd done it constantly, while cooking or gardening or folding laundry. It was just some old tune she'd learned as a girl, nothing famous or well-known. She'd whistle it so often that it had become background noise to his childhood visits to her house, and she'd been dead for 15 years. Rhett hadn't thought about that tune in over a decade. He'd never heard anyone else whistle it. It wasn't a popular song or a recognizable melody. It was just something his grandmother did, a small personal quirk that had died with her. But now someone was whistling it in the darkness outside his tent, circling him in the middle of the wilderness in the dead of night. The impossibility of it made him feel dizzy. There was no way, no rational way this could be happening. Nobody knew that song. He'd never told anyone about it, never hummed it, or whistled it himself. It existed only in his memories of childhood afternoons at his grandmother's house, sunlight streaming through her kitchen windows while she whistled and made sandwiches. The idea that someone out here, in this specific spot at this specific time, would happen to know and whistle that exact melody was beyond coincidence. It was impossible. The whistling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes. Sometimes it would fade, as if the whistler had moved farther away, and Rhett would feel a momentary relief. But then it would grow louder again, returning to its methodical circling pattern. His sleeping bag was soaked with sweat despite the cold. His hands were shaking. He kept telling himself to look outside, to unzip the tent and shine his flashlight and confront whatever was out there. But he couldn't make himself do it. Some deep instinct told him that looking would be a mistake, that whatever was creating that sound was not something he wanted to see. Eventually, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the whistling stopped. There was no final flourish, no farewell. It simply ended mid-phrase, leaving only silence and the normal sounds of the forest waking up. Rhett lay in his tent for another 20 minutes, listening and waiting, before he finally worked up the courage to look outside. He unzipped the tent with trembling hands and stuck his head out into the cold morning air. The clearing looked exactly as it had when he'd gone to sleep. His fire ring was cold and dead. His pack hung from the bear cable where he'd left it. Everything was normal, except when he climbed fully out of the tent and looked at the ground. He saw something that made his blood run cold. The dirt around his campsite was soft, the kind that takes footprints easily. He could see his own prints from the previous evening, the pattern of his boot treads clearly visible. But there were no other prints. None. He walked the entire perimeter of where the whistling had been coming from, studying the ground carefully. Nothing. Not a single footprint. Not a disturbed leaf. Not a broken twig. Just his own tracks from yesterday and the undisturbed forest floor. Rhett packed up his gear with shaking hands. He didn't make breakfast, didn't take time to filter more water. He just stuffed everything into his pack and started. Hiking. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that there had to be an explanation. Maybe the ground wasn't as soft as it looked. Maybe he was misremembering where the whistling had come from. Maybe he'd been dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion. But he knew none of those explanations were true. He knew what he'd heard, and he knew what he hadn't found. Someone or something had circled his tent for nearly an hour, whistling his dead grandmother's song, and left no trace of its presence. The hike out seemed to take forever. Rhett kept looking over his shoulder, kept stopping to listen for footsteps or whistling, but the forest was silent except for birds and wind. When he finally reached his truck, he sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what had happened. He considered reporting it to the ranger station, but what would he say? That someone had whistled at him? That there were no footprints? It sounded insane, even in his own head. He drove back to Portland that afternoon 3 days earlier than planned. He never returned to that section of Olympic National Park. Sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, he finds himself thinking about that melody. His grandmother had been a kind woman, gentle and loving. She died peacefully in her sleep at 83. There was no reason her memory should be connected to whatever happened in those woods. But he can't shake the feeling that somehow it was her out there, or something pretending to be her, or using her memory for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. He's tried to forget the tune, but it's lodged in his mind now, surfacing at random moments. And whenever he hears it in his thoughts, he's back in that tent, listening to something impossible circle him in the darkness, whistling a song that should have died 15 years ago. Max had always been the careful type, the kind of father who triple-checked car seats and read every parenting book he could find. His wife Sloane was the same way, which is probably why they'd chosen such a safe, established campground for their first family camping trip. The Finger Lakes region of New York was known for being family-friendly, and this particular lakeside campground had excellent reviews, clean facilities, and a camp host who lived on-site year-round. Their daughters were 7 and 5, old enough to enjoy the experience, but young enough that everything still felt like a grand adventure. They'd packed carefully, brought every possible supply they might need, and arrived on a warm July afternoon with plenty of time to set up before dark. The campsite they'd been assigned was perfect, just a short walk from the bathrooms, but far enough from other campers to feel private. A ring of tall oaks surrounded their spot, and through the trees they could see glimpses of the lake sparkling in the afternoon sun. Max set up their large family tent, while Sloane organized their supplies, and the girls ran around collecting pine cones and interesting leaves. By evening, they had a fire going, hot dogs roasting, and both daughters sticky with marshmallow residue and grinning from ear to ear. This was exactly what Max had hoped for when he'd suggested the trip. Quality family time, fresh air, a break from the endless screen time that seemed to dominate their lives back home. They stayed up later than usual, pointing out stars and telling silly stories until the girls' eyes started drooping. Everyone brushed their teeth at the camp spigot, climbed into their sleeping bags, and settled in for the night. Max woke first, the way he usually did at home, when he needed to use the bathroom in the early morning hours. The tent was dim but not dark, enough pre-dawn light filtering through the nylon that he could make out shapes. He checked his watch and saw it was almost 6, later than he'd expected. They'd all slept well, exhausted from the travel and excitement. He was about to unzip his sleeping bag when he noticed something odd about the tent wall nearest him. There were marks on it, visible from the inside as darker patches against the green fabric. He leaned closer, squinting in the weak light, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. They looked like handprints, pressed against the outside of the tent, hard enough that the fabric had been pushed slightly inward, leaving visible impressions. His first thought was that maybe one of the girls had gotten up in the night and touched the tent from outside, though that didn't make much sense. Why would they leave the tent and then press their hands against it? He carefully extracted himself from his sleeping bag, trying not to wake Sloane or the girls, and unzipped the tent entrance as quietly as he could. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of the lake and wet grass. He stepped outside, in his socks, and immediately froze. The entire tent was covered in muddy handprints. They were everywhere, starting at ground level and extending all the way up to the peak of the dome tent, which had to be at least 8 feet high. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping in some places, spread out in others. The mud was reddish-brown and still slightly damp, leaving streaks where prints had smeared together. Max felt his chest tighten as he slowly walked around the tent, counting prints, trying to understand what he was looking at. The prints weren't quite right. They were adult-sized, definitely too large to belong to his daughters, but the proportions were off. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow. They looked almost like someone had taken a normal hand and stretched it, elongating everything just enough to trigger that uncanny valley feeling of wrongness. Some of the prints were clear and distinct, showing every detail of the stretched fingers. Others were smeared, as if whatever made them had dragged its hands across the tent fabric. The pattern was chaotic. No clear organization or purpose to the placement. Just hundreds of muddy handprints covering every surface of their family tent while they slept inside. He stood there for what felt like a long time, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. This wasn't possible. They would have heard something. The tent fabric would have made noise with that much contact. Someone pressing their hands all over the tent, reaching 8 feet high, doing it hundreds of times. That would have created sound. He was a light sleeper, especially when camping. There was no way this could have happened without waking someone up. But the evidence was undeniable. He reached out and touched one of the prints, feeling the slightly tacky texture of drying mud. It was real. This had really happened while they slept. Sloane emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and stopped mid-step when she saw his face. She asked what was wrong, and he just pointed at the tent wall beside her. He watched her expression shift from confusion to shock to something close to panic as she processed what she was seeing. She walked around the tent just as he had, her hand over her mouth, shaking her head slowly. The girls were still sleeping inside, and both parents stood outside in the cool morning, staring at their tent like it was a crime scene. Because that's what it felt like, a violation. Someone or something had spent time, possibly hours, methodically covering their shelter with muddy handprints while their children slept inside. The thought made Max feel physically sick. Other campers were starting to emerge from their tents, and Max saw one couple stop and stare at them from across the campground road. He realized how it must look and felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with his fear. Sloane went inside to keep the girls occupied and calm, while Max walked to the camp host's cabin. The host was an older man, probably in his 60s, with weathered skin and the capable look of someone who'd spent their entire life outdoors. Max explained the situation, trying to keep his voice steady, and the host followed him back to their campsite with a puzzled expression that suggested he thought this was going to be some misunderstanding or overreaction. But when they rounded the bend and the tent came into view, the host stopped walking. His face went pale in a way that made Max's fear spike higher. This wasn't the expression of someone seeing something weird or unusual. This was the expression of someone seeing something they recognized, something that terrified them. Max asked if this had happened before, if there was an explanation, but the host just stood there, staring at the tent. Finally, he turned to Max and said in a quiet, strained voice that they needed to leave. Not pack up and leave in a few hours, but leave right now, immediately. He offered no explanation, no context, just an urgent insistence that they get their family out of this campground as quickly as possible. Max tried to press for details, tried to understand what was happening, but the host refused to elaborate. He just kept saying they needed to go, his eyes darting to the tree line and back to the tent like he expected something to emerge from the forest at any moment. Sloane had come outside by then, holding their youngest, who was asking questions about the mud. The host looked at the little girl, and his expression softened, but became even more urgent. He said, "Please, just please trust him and go." There was something in his voice, a genuine terror barely held in check, that convinced them. They woke their older daughter, told both girls they were going to get breakfast in town as a special treat, and started breaking down camp while the host watched from a distance. Max tried to take photos of the handprints with his phone, thinking they might need evidence, or that he'd want to investigate this later. But when he looked at the photos afterward, they showed the tent, they showed the mud, but somehow the wrongness of the prints didn't translate. In the pictures, they just looked like regular handprints. Messy, but not particularly strange. The elongated fingers, the uncanny proportions, none of that came through in the digital images. It was like trying to photograph a dream. The reality was there, but the feeling of it couldn't be captured. They loaded everything into their car in record time, the girls sensing their parents' tension and staying uncharacteristically quiet. Before they pulled out, Max walked back to the host's cabin one more time. The old man was standing on his porch, still watching their campsite like he expected something to happen. Max asked again what this was about, why he'd reacted that way, what he knew. The host looked at him for a long moment, and Max could see him wrestling with whether to say anything. Finally, he spoke just 3 words that Max would replay in his mind for months afterward. He said this has happened before, then went inside his cabin and closed the door. Max stood on the empty porch for a few seconds, then walked back to his car where his family was waiting. They drove for an hour before stopping for breakfast, partly to get distance, and partly because neither Max nor Sloane trusted themselves to speak without frightening the girls. Over pancakes at a busy diner that felt blessedly normal and safe, they tried to make sense of what had happened. The mud had come from the lake shore. They'd realized that from the reddish color that matched the clay-rich soil at the water's edge. That was 200 yards from their campsite through dense undergrowth. Whatever made those prints had traveled that distance, possibly multiple times to gather mud and then systematically cover their tent. The prints going 8 feet high meant either someone impossibly tall or someone using a ladder, which seemed absurd. And the wrongness of the hand proportions that stretched and distorted quality, neither of them could explain that. Their youngest mentioned at one point that she'd heard the tall man walking during the night. Max and Sloane exchanged a look, but tried to keep their voices casual as they asked what she meant. She said she heard footsteps around the tent and knew someone was there, but she kept her eyes closed because she wasn't supposed to get out of her sleeping bag at night. She said it so matter-of-factly, the way children do when they haven't yet learned which things should be frightening. Max felt his hands shaking as he cut his daughter's pancakes. She'd been awake. She'd heard whatever was out there, and had the good sense or good fortune to stay still and quiet. They never went back to that campground. Max called a few weeks later to ask the host about what had happened, but the number had been disconnected. He tried reaching out to the State Park Service that managed the area, but they had no record of similar incidents and seemed to think he was exaggerating or confused. The whole thing existed now only in their memories and in the photos on his phone that showed muddy handprints, but couldn't capture the true horror of what they'd seen. Sometimes Max lies awake at night thinking about those prints, about the impossible height of them, about the elongated fingers, and the sheer number of times something had pressed its hands against that thin nylon while his children slept inside. He thinks about the camp host's face, the recognition and fear in his eyes, the way he'd said this had happened before like it was a known thing, a recurring problem that no one wanted to acknowledge. What disturbs him most isn't the mystery of what created the prints. It's the fact that someone knew what it meant, and their first instinct was to make sure Max's family got away as fast as possible. Whatever had visited their tent that night, it was something familiar, enough to terrify a man who'd probably seen every kind of wildlife and weather the forest could offer. Something that made a lifetime outdoorsman tell strangers to run without asking questions. Max has never been camping since, and neither has Sloane. Their daughters occasionally ask why they stopped going, and they make excuses about being too busy or preferring hotels. But the real reason hangs unspoken between them. A memory of muddy hands pressed against nylon and a voice telling them to leave before something came back. Have you or your family ever experienced something while camping that made you pack up and leave immediately? What would you have done if you woke up to find those handprints covering your tent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Charlie had been working as a nurse in Colorado Springs for almost 3 years, and the job had given her both immense satisfaction and complete exhaustion in equal measure. The long shifts, the emotional weight of caring for people at their most vulnerable, the constant demand for compassion. Even when her own reserves were running low, all of it had built up until she felt like she needed to reconnect with something beyond hospital walls and fluorescent lighting. She'd grown up hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park with her parents, and some of her best childhood memories involved alpine meadows and crisp mountain air. So when she had a long weekend off in mid-August, she decided to go back to those familiar trails, to spend a night in the backcountry and remember what it felt like to exist outside the constant pressure of her work life. She chose a route she'd hiked at least a dozen times over the years, a moderately challenging trail that led up into alpine terrain with stunning views of the surrounding peaks. The trail was well marked, popular enough to be maintained but not so crowded that you'd encounter people every few minutes. She knew every landmark, every switchback, every place where the trees opened up to reveal the valley below. That familiarity was part of the appeal. She didn't want adventure or discovery right now. She wanted the comfort of known places, the reassurance of terrain she could navigate almost without thinking. She started hiking in the early afternoon, her pack loaded with everything she'd need for one night out. The weather was perfect, warm, but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. The hike up went exactly as she remembered. She passed the boulder shaped like a crouching bear about 2 miles in, crossed the creek at the wooden footbridge, climbed the steep section where exposed roots formed natural steps. Every detail matched her memory. By late afternoon, she reached her planned campsite, a flat area near a small alpine lake where she'd stayed twice before. She set up her tent, filtered water from the lake, and made a simple dinner while watching the sun paint the peaks orange and pink. As darkness settled in, she felt more relaxed than she had in months. This was what she'd needed. This silence and simplicity. This temporary escape from responsibility and routine. She woke the next morning feeling restored, had coffee and oatmeal while watching mist rise off the lake, then decided to take a short evening hike before breaking camp. There was a trail that made a loop from her campsite, maybe 2 miles round trip, that led through a particularly beautiful section of alpine meadow before circling back. She'd done it several times before, always in the evening when the light was best. She left most of her gear at camp, just taking water, her phone, and a light jacket. The trail started out exactly as she remembered, winding through scattered pines and across open areas dotted with late summer wildflowers. But after about 20 minutes of walking, she started to notice things that felt off. The trail markers were in the right places, those standard wooden posts with directional arrows carved into them, but the landscape around them didn't quite match her memory. There was supposed to be a distinctive dead tree at one point, bleached white by weather, and standing alone in a clearing. She remembered it clearly because it looked almost sculptural, like something deliberately placed. But when she reached where it should have been, the clearing was there, but the tree wasn't. In its place was a cluster of boulders she didn't remember seeing before. She told herself she was misremembering that maybe the tree had fallen in a storm, and she was confusing this section with another part of the trail. But the unease started then, a small, persistent feeling that something wasn't right. She kept walking, and the feeling grew stronger. The distances between landmarks seemed wrong. The meadow she was heading toward should have appeared after about 40 minutes of hiking, but she'd been walking for nearly an hour and hadn't reached it yet. The trail itself looked correct. The markers were where they should be, but the spaces between them felt stretched out, elongated in a way that made no sense. She checked her phone and saw that her GPS showed her position as exactly where she should be according to the trail map. But what she was seeing around her didn't match. The vegetation was slightly different. The rock formations weren't quite right. Even the quality of light seemed off in a way she couldn't articulate. When she finally reached what should have been the meadow, her confusion turned to something closer to panic. The meadow existed, but it was wrong. It was too large, extending farther than it should have. There were features she didn't recognize. A small pond that shouldn't be there. A line of aspens growing where she remembered only grass and wildflowers. She stood at the edge of this impossible meadow, her heart beating faster, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew should be there. This was a trail she'd hiked a dozen times. She knew it. But the landscape was insisting she was wrong, showing her something that didn't match any of her carefully stored memories. She turned around, deciding to head back to her campsite, suddenly desperate for the familiar anchor of her tent and gear. But the return journey was even worse. The trail seemed different going back, winding in ways she didn't remember. She passed landmarks that should have been on the outbound leg, but that she had no memory of seeing. Twice she came to intersections that shouldn't exist, trail splits that weren't on her map, and that her GPS insisted weren't there. But they were there, physical and real, forcing her to make choices about which path to take based on instinct rather than knowledge. The sun was getting lower, the shadows growing, longer, and she was lost on a trail she could have hiked blindfolded. 3 hours passed. 3 hours of walking on what should have been a 2-mile loop, and she still hadn't found her campsite. The rational part of her brain kept insisting this was impossible. She had her GPS, she had the trail markers, she knew this area, but the evidence of her senses was undeniable. She was wandering in terrain that looked almost right but wasn't, following a trail that seemed correct but led nowhere she recognized. At one point, she sat down on a rock, pulled out her phone, and stared at the GPS display. It showed her as a blue dot on the trail, exactly where she should be, moving in a sensible pattern that would bring her back to her campsite within minutes. But when she looked up from the screen at the actual landscape around her, nothing matched. The worst part was the silence. Rocky Mountain National Park was never truly silent. There were always birds, always wind through the trees, always the ambient sounds of a living ecosystem. But as the afternoon stretched on and her confusion deepened, she realized she couldn't hear any of that. The forest around her was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like something was holding its breath, or like she'd somehow stepped into a version of this place that existed slightly outside of normal space, close enough to see familiar shapes, but too far away to actually be there. Darkness was coming, and she was genuinely frightened now. She'd been hiking for hours, her water was running low, and she had no idea where she was, despite all her technology insisting she was exactly where she should be. Then, just as panic was really setting in, she crested a small rise and saw her tent. It was right there, exactly where she'd left it, her gear arranged around it just as she remembered. The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. She half ran down to her campsite, touched the tent fabric to confirm it was real, and only then allowed herself to sit down and try to process what had just happened. She checked her phone. According to the timestamp, she'd been gone for just over 3 hours. According to her GPS history, She'd walked the loop trail in a perfectly normal pattern, completing it in about the time it should have taken. But her lived experience told a completely different story. She'd been lost, deeply and frighteningly lost, in terrain that shifted and changed around her, like something from a dream. She looked at the photos she'd taken during the hike, thinking they might show the strangeness she'd experienced. But they didn't. The photos showed normal trail markers, familiar scenery, everything exactly as it should be. The dead tree that wasn't there, the meadow that was wrong. None of that strangeness came through in the images. They looked like photos from any other hike she'd done on this trail. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her tent with her headlamp on, staring at the nylon ceiling, trying to understand what had happened. Had she experienced some kind of medical event, a stroke or seizure that had affected her perception and memory? But she felt fine physically, no headache, no confusion beyond the confusion of the experience itself. Had she somehow gotten turned around and hiked a completely different trail without realizing it? But the GPS data said no, and besides, she knew this area too well to make that kind of mistake. The only explanation that fit was also the most disturbing one. For 3 hours, she'd been somewhere else. Not physically somewhere else. The GPS proved she'd stayed on the trail, but somewhere that existed in the same physical space while being fundamentally different. At first light, she packed up faster than she'd ever broken camp before. She hiked out on the same trail she'd come in on, and this time everything was normal. Every landmark was where it should be. Every distance matched her expectations. The whole route was exactly as familiar as it had always been. She made it back to the trailhead in good time, loaded her gear into her car, and sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. She'd been camping and hiking her entire life. She was an experienced outdoors person, comfortable with wilderness and solitude. But what happened on that trail had shaken something fundamental in her understanding of reality. She went back to work the following week and threw herself into her shifts with even more intensity than before. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened. How could she? The story made no sense even to her, and she'd lived through it. A few months later, curiosity got the better of her, and she returned to Rocky Mountain National Park. She didn't go back to that specific trail, couldn't bring herself to, but she hiked other familiar routes to see if the experience would repeat. Everything was normal. The trails were exactly as they should be. The landmarks matched her memories. The distances made sense. Whatever had happened that August evening seemed to be a one-time event, an anomaly that had opened and closed like a door to somewhere else. But she doesn't hike alone anymore. She tried once, about a year after the incident, and lasted maybe an hour before the anxiety became overwhelming. Every trail marker looked potentially wrong. Every familiar landmark seemed like it might shift into something else. The confidence she'd always had in her knowledge of these mountains was gone, replaced by the haunting awareness that the landscape might not always be what it appears to be. She still loves the mountains, still feels called to them, but now she brings friends along. Not because she's afraid of getting lost in any conventional sense. She's afraid of getting lost the way she did that evening, of slipping into a version of the world that exists right next to ours, but follows different rules. And she's afraid that next time, she might not find her way back. Have you ever been on a familiar trail that suddenly felt wrong, like you'd stepped into an alternate version of a place you knew well? What would you do if your GPS insisted you were exactly where you should be, but everything around you looked different? Share your thoughts below. Felix and Kingston had been friends since their sophomore year at University of Texas, bonding over a shared love of outdoor adventure and a mutual inability to take life too seriously. Now, 5 years after graduation, they still made time for annual trips together, usually something involving camping or hiking in places that felt as far from their desk jobs as possible. This year, they'd chosen Big Bend National Park in April, drawn by the promise of desert landscapes and genuinely remote backcountry. They'd both done plenty of camping before, but never in terrain quite like this. The Chihuahuan Desert was a different beast from the forests and mountains they were used to. All exposed rock and sparse vegetation, and a particular quality of silence that felt almost physical. They'd gotten permits for a backcountry site about 6 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a rough trail that wound through increasingly isolated country. The hike in had been hot despite the relatively mild April temperatures, and by the time they reached their designated campsite in the late afternoon, both men were sunburned and dehydrated. But the location was incredible. A flat area surrounded by rocky outcroppings with views that stretched for miles in every direction. They could see the Chisos Mountains in the distance, purple and hazy against the bright sky. As the sun set, the temperature dropped rapidly, the way it does in the desert, and they built a fire more for light and companionship than warmth. They stayed up later than planned, talking about work and relationships, and all the usual topics that emerge when old friends get time together away from their normal lives. Kingston had recently gotten engaged and was full of wedding planning stress. Felix was considering quitting his job and moving to Colorado, tired of Texas heat and corporate culture. The conversation meandered the way it does around campfires, jumping from topic to topic without much structure. By the time they finally climbed into their tent around 11, they were both tired in that satisfied way that comes from fresh air and good company. The tent they were sharing was a 2-person backpacking model, cramped but adequate, and they settled into their sleeping bags expecting nothing more eventful than a good night's sleep. Felix woke suddenly around midnight, pulled from sleep by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. He lay still listening, trying to figure out what had disturbed him. Then he heard it clearly. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking through the desert scrub toward their campsite. The sound was distinctive, the crunch of gravel and the rustle of vegetation being pushed aside. He reached over and shook Kingston awake, putting a finger to his lips when his friend started to speak. They both lay there, in the darkness, listening to the approaching footsteps. Felix called out hello, his voice sounding loud and strange in the desert silence. No response. The footsteps continued steady and unhurried, coming closer. Kingston tried next, calling out that this was their campsite and asking who was there. Still no response, just the continued sound of someone walking toward them through the darkness. They fumbled for their flashlights, clicked them on, and unzipped the tent entrance. The beams of light swept across their campsite, illuminating their scattered gear, the cold remains of their fire, the rocky ground beyond. But there was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing that could account for the footsteps they were both clearly hearing. The sound was maybe 20 feet away now, and getting closer. Felix could track its progress by the noise, could hear exactly where it was relative to their tent, but his flashlight showed only empty desert. Kingston was saying something, his voice tight with confusion, asking what this was and where the sound was coming from. Felix had no answers. The footsteps reached the edge of their campsite and began to circle. Not quickly, not in any kind of aggressive pattern, just a steady walking pace moving in a wide circle around their tent. They kept their flashlights pointed at where the sound was coming from, swinging the beams around as the footsteps moved, but the light revealed nothing. Just rocks and sparse vegetation and empty air. Then the footsteps stopped. For a few seconds there was complete silence, and Felix felt a momentary relief, thinking maybe it was over. But then he heard breathing, heavy, labored breathing like someone who'd been running or exerting themselves. It was coming from just outside the tent, so close that Felix instinctively scooted backward, even though the tent fabric wouldn't provide any actual protection. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 3 or 4 minutes. Deep inhalations and exhalations, the sound of lungs working hard, of something substantial and alive right there with them in the darkness. Kingston was gripping his flashlight so hard his knuckles were white. Felix could see his friend's face in the reflected glow, eyes wide and fixed on the tent wall where the breathing was coming from. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? They were listening to something breathe just inches away from them, something they couldn't see, something that had walked up to their tent with purpose and now stood there in the night. The tent fabric moved slightly, not from wind, but from the displacement of air caused by the breathing. Felix could see the shadow of it, the way the fabric pressed inward just slightly with each exhalation. Whatever was out there was real, physical, close enough to touch the tent. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the breathing stopped. They heard footsteps again, moving away from the tent this time, crunching through the gravel and scrub in the direction they'd originally come from. The sound faded gradually, growing fainter and fainter, until finally there was only the normal silence of the desert night. Felix and Kingston sat there for a long time, neither moving, neither speaking, just listening and waiting to see if it would come back. When they finally started talking, their voices were shaky. They went over what had just happened, confirming with each other that they'd both heard the same things, that this wasn't one person's imagination or a dream. The footsteps, the circling, the breathing, all of it had been real and shared. They didn't sleep the rest of that night. They lay in their sleeping bags with flashlights on, jumping at every small sound, every whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. As soon as the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, they climbed out of the tent to examine their campsite. This was what disturbed Felix most in retrospect. The ground around their tent was a mixture of dirt and gravel, the kind that takes tracks fairly well. They could see their own footprints from the previous evening, the patterns from their boot treads clearly visible. But there was nothing else. No other prints, no disturbances in the dirt, no sign that anything had walked in a circle around their tent or stood breathing just outside the fabric. The only tracks were their own. They debated what to do. They had permits for 2 more nights, had planned a whole itinerary of day hikes from this base camp, but neither of them wanted to stay. There was something about the experience that felt fundamentally wrong, not just frightening, but wrong in a way that suggested staying would be a mistake. They packed up their gear in near silence, both lost in their own thoughts, and started the hike back to the trailhead. It was only when they were about a mile from their campsite that Kingston mentioned the ring. He'd noticed it while they were packing up, sitting on a flat rock right at the edge of where they'd pitched their tent. A wedding ring, old and tarnished, gold with some kind of engraving on the inside. Felix hadn't seen him pick it up, and now Kingston held it out in his palm, both of them staring at it in the morning light. The engraving was hard to read, worn almost smooth by age and wear, but they could make out a date. 1952. The ring looked like it had been out in the elements for decades. The gold darkened and pitted in places. Kingston turned it over in his fingers, and they both felt the strangeness of it. This hadn't been there when they'd set up camp. They would have noticed it, which meant it had appeared during the night, left there by whatever had circled their tent and breathed outside their door. When they reached the ranger station, they debated whether to report what had happened. They settled on turning in the ring and mentioning they'd found it at their campsite, without going into detail about the circumstances. The ranger who took the ring was a woman in her 50s, who'd probably been working in the park for years. She looked at the ring, turned it over to read the date, and her expression changed. She asked where exactly they'd found it, and when they described the location, she nodded slowly, like something had just been confirmed. Then she told them something that made Felix's blood run cold. 3 people had disappeared in that area in the 1950s. They'd gone out on a day hike and never came back. Search parties had found nothing, no bodies, no gear, no indication of what had happened to them. It had been a significant event at the time, enough to make regional news. The disappearances had never been solved. The ranger said the ring would be logged and stored with other items related to those cold cases, and she thanked them for bringing it in. Then, almost as an afterthought, she asked if they'd experienced anything unusual during their stay. Felix and Kingston looked at each other, and something in that shared glance made them both decide to tell the truth. They described the footsteps, the circling, the breathing. The ranger listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but her attention completely focused. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said they weren't the first people to report something like that in the backcountry areas of Big Bend. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer theories or explanations, just acknowledged that others had experienced similar things and that the Park Service had documented reports going back decades. She thanked them again for the ring and for the report, and that was the end of the conversation. Felix and Kingston drove out of the park that afternoon. Their camping trip cut short by 2 days. They stopped at a diner in a small town outside the park boundaries and sat there for hours, drinking coffee and trying to process everything. The thing that bothered Felix most wasn't the fear he'd felt during the experience, though that had been real and intense. It was the implications. Whatever had walked up to their tent had been intelligent enough to find them in the middle of nowhere, patient enough to circle their campsite for minutes, and deliberate enough to leave the ring behind. That suggested intention, purpose, maybe even communication. But communication of what? A warning, a message, a game. They still talk about it sometimes, usually late at night when they've had a few drinks, and the conversation turns to weird experiences and unexplained events. Kingston is married now, and his wife knows the story. She thinks they encountered something paranormal, maybe connected to the people who disappeared in the 50s. Felix isn't sure what he thinks. He's researched the disappearances, read everything he could find about that area of Big Bend, looked for patterns or explanations. But there's nothing definitive, just a handful of missing people from decades ago, and a pattern of strange reports that the Park Service acknowledges but doesn't explain. Neither of them has been back to Big Bend. Felix still camps, regularly, still loves the outdoors, but he's careful about where he goes, and he never camps alone anymore. There's something about that night that changed his relationship with wilderness. He used to think of nature as neutral, indifferent to human presence. Now he's not so sure. Whatever walked around their tent that night knew they were there. It came to them specifically, interacted with their space, left them something to find. That suggests a level of awareness and intention that doesn't fit with anything Felix learned in biology classes or nature documentaries. It suggests there are things in the wilderness that notice us, that pay attention, that have their own inscrutable purposes, and sometimes, for reasons we may never understand, they choose to make contact. The ring is sitting in a storage facility somewhere in Big Bend National Park, logged as evidence in a cold case from 70 years ago. Felix wonders sometimes if finding it brought any closure to anyone, if there are still people alive who remember the disappearances and wonder what happened. He wonders if the ring was meant for them specifically, or if it would have been left for whoever happened to camp in that spot. Mostly, though, he wonders about those 3 or 4 minutes of breathing, about what stood just outside their tent in the darkness, and why it chose that moment to reveal itself. He's grateful it walked away. But part of him, the part that loves mysteries and unsolved questions, wishes he'd had the courage to open the tent and look. Not because he thinks he would have seen anything. The flashlights had already proven that whatever was there couldn't be seen in conventional ways. But because maybe, just maybe, looking would have shown him something that would make sense of the experience. Something that would turn it from a frightening anomaly into a comprehensible event. But he didn't look, and now he never will. All he has is the memory of footsteps circling in the darkness, of breathing that came from something present but invisible, and of a tarnished gold ring that connected their experience to tragedies that happened before either of them was born. That's enough to keep him awake some nights, enough to make him check and double-check his campsite before settling in for the night, enough to make him grateful for the presence of other people when he's out in wild places. Because now he knows that sometimes, in certain places, under certain circumstances, You might find yourself sharing space with something that follows rules we don't understand. And when that happens, the best thing you can do is respect its presence, accept that you'll never fully understand what occurred, and be grateful when it chooses to walk away into the darkness rather than stay. If something invisible circled your tent and you could hear it breathing just inches from you, would you have looked outside or stayed frozen in fear? Have you ever heard footsteps with no visible source? Let us know in the comments. Judah had always considered herself a rational person, someone who trusted observable evidence and logical explanations over supernatural speculation. Her graduate work in ecology at the University of Vermont demanded that kind of disciplined thinking, and it had served her well throughout her academic career. She was methodical in her research, careful with her conclusions, skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or tested. So when she planned a solo camping trip to Green Mountain National Forest in October, she approached it with the same practical mindset she brought to everything else. She had quality gear, she knew the area reasonably well, and she'd checked weather forecasts and trail conditions. It was supposed to be a straightforward overnight trip, a brief escape from her thesis work, and a chance to clear her head before the final push toward her defense. The campsite she chose was one she'd used before, located near a distinctive split boulder that made it easy to find even in failing light. The boulder was massive, probably 15 feet tall, split down the middle by some ancient geological process that had left two halves leaning slightly away from each other. It was a landmark she'd photographed multiple times for her field journals, always from the same angle because she liked consistency in her documentation. She arrived in the early afternoon with plenty of time to set up camp properly. She positioned her tent at a specific angle to the boulder, calculating the best orientation for morning sun and wind protection. Her camp chair went to the left of the fire ring, placed precisely where it would give her the best view of the forest while staying close to the warmth. Her boots she set near the tent entrance to dry, laced in the particular way she always did, left over right, with the loops pulled to equal tension. Everything had its place, arranged with the kind of attention to detail that came naturally to someone who spent their days measuring plant populations and recording environmental variables. She even took a photo of the setup from several angles, part of her habit of documenting outdoor experiences for later reference. With camp established to her satisfaction, she decided to gather firewood before the light faded completely. There was plenty of deadfall within a few hundred yards, and she estimated she'd need maybe 20 minutes to collect enough for the evening. She grabbed a stuff sack from her pack and headed into the forest, moving in a systematic pattern to cover ground efficiently. The forest in October was beautiful in that melancholy way that comes just before winter. Leaves mostly fallen, and the understory thinned enough to see deeper into the woods. She moved quietly, selecting appropriate pieces of wood and breaking them to size, her mind wandering to her research and the data analysis she still needed to complete. She was maybe 200 yards from camp, well within sight of the split boulder when she realized she'd been out longer than intended. A glance at her watch showed 23 minutes had passed. She headed back with her collection of firewood, already thinking about the freeze-dried meal she'd brought and whether she wanted coffee or tea with dinner. When she stepped back into her campsite, she stopped so abruptly she nearly tripped over her own feet. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The tent was in the same position, the same angle to the boulder. Her camp chair sat in the same spot. Her boots were by the tent entrance, but something was wrong. She couldn't identify it at first, just a deep, visceral sense that what she was looking at wasn't quite right. She stood at the edge of her campsite, her arms full of firewood, staring at her own gear and trying to understand why every instinct was screaming that this was not the camp she'd left 20 minutes ago. Then she saw it. The sleeping bag inside her tent, visible through the mesh door she'd left partially open for ventilation. The zipper was on the wrong side. She always zipped from left to right, a meaningless habit, but one she'd maintained for years. But looking at it now, the zipper pull was on the right side, suggesting someone had opened it from right to left. She dropped the firewood and moved closer, her heart starting to beat faster. Her water bottle sat in the side pocket of her pack, and she could see even from outside the tent that it was full. She'd drunk at least half of it before leaving to gather wood. She was certain of that. She remembered the weight of it, remembered setting it down still half empty. Judah unzipped the tent with shaking hands and crawled inside. Her boots. She could see them through the tent entrance, and the laces were wrong. She'd laced them left over right the way she always did. But these were laced right over left. The pattern was reversed. She backed out of the tent and walked slowly around her campsite, cataloging discrepancies. The camp chair was in the right location but facing a few degrees off from where she'd positioned it. The rocks around her fire ring were arranged in almost the same pattern, but not quite. One that had been on the left side of the circle was now on the right. The whole setup was like a mirror image that had been reflected back imperfectly, close enough to pass a casual inspection, but wrong in dozens of small ways. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and opened her photos. She'd taken pictures of her camp setup less than half an hour ago. She pulled them up and compared them to what she was seeing now. The differences were undeniable. In her photo, the tent door zipper was clearly on the left. In reality, it was on the right. In her photo, her boots were laced left over right. Standing in front of her, they were laced right over left. Someone or something had recreated her campsite with meticulous attention to detail, but had gotten the small things reversed, like a drawing made by someone, looking at a reflection rather than the original. Judah's academic training kicked in, even as panic tried to overwhelm her rational mind. She needed more data. She pulled out the trail camera she'd brought, something she used in her research to document wildlife activity. She'd set it up earlier, mounted on a tree facing her campsite, programmed to take photos every few minutes. She retrieved the camera with hands that wouldn't quite steady and scrolled through the images. What she saw made her sit down hard on the ground, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The camera had captured her setting up camp, then her leaving to gather firewood. For the next 23 minutes, it had photographed her empty campsite at regular intervals, except in every single image there was no one there. No person moving around the camp, no figure rearranging her gear, just the empty site, photographed over and over. But in the images, she could see the changes happening. One photo would show her sleeping bag zipped one way. The next photo, 3 minutes later, would show it zipped from the opposite direction. One image showed her water bottle half full. The next showed it completely full. The boots changed between frames. The chair rotated slightly. The rocks around the fire ring swapped positions. All of this happening in an apparently empty campsite, with no visible agent making the changes. She scrolled back and forth through the images, her scientific mind trying to find a rational explanation, even as a deeper part of her recognized there wasn't one. The changes were too precise to be random. Someone or something had studied her camp setup and recreated it exactly, but from a reversed perspective. And they'd done it in the 23 minutes she was away, completely invisible to her trail camera. She thought about the implications of that. Either something with intelligence had been in her campsite, moving her things with purpose and intention, or reality itself had somehow glitched, swapping her camp with an alternate version that was almost but not quite the same. The light was fading now, the forest growing dark around her. Judah made a decision. She packed her gear with frantic efficiency, not bothering to organize anything properly, just shoving items into her pack and tent bag. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manage the buckles and zippers. She kept looking around, expecting to see someone watching her from the trees, but the forest appeared empty. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, though, a physical pressure that made her skin crawl. Whatever had done this was still here. She was certain of it. Watching her realize what had happened, watching her panic and flee. She hiked out in growing darkness, using her headlamp and moving faster than was safe on the uneven trail. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a presence. It took her over an hour to reach the parking area where she'd left her car, and she'd never been so grateful to see a vehicle in her life. She threw her gear in the back and sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked, breathing hard and trying to calm down enough to drive safely. The trail camera was still in her hand. She couldn't stop looking at the images, scrolling through them over and over, watching her campsite change, frame by frame, with no visible cause. Back in her apartment that night, she transferred the photos to her computer and examined them with the analytical tool she used for her research. She zoomed in on every pixel, looking for evidence of manipulation or error. But the images were clean. No signs of digital alteration, no artifacts that would suggest the camera had malfunctioned. Just a clear photographic record of objects moving and changing in an empty space. She looked at her physical gear too, examining every item she'd brought back. The sleeping bag really was zipped from the wrong direction. The bootlaces really were reversed. The water bottle really was full despite her having drunk from it. These weren't false memories or misperceptions. They were physical facts, measurable and observable. Over the following weeks, Judah tried to find explanations. She researched cases of missing time, of spatial anomalies, of anything that might account for what she'd experienced. She found plenty of stories, but no satisfying answers. She considered the possibility that she'd experienced some kind of dissociative episode, that she'd rearranged her own camp during a fugue state and simply didn't remember. But that didn't explain the trail camera images showing changes happening in an empty campsite. It didn't explain the meticulous reversal of details, the mirror image quality of the recreation. The experience changed something fundamental in how she viewed the world. She'd built her entire academic career on the assumption that reality was consistent and measurable, that careful observation would always reveal underlying patterns and explanations. But now she had photographic evidence of something that shouldn't be possible, something that suggested reality might not be as stable as she'd believed. Objects had moved in her campsite while no one was there. Her gear had been rearranged by invisible hands or by some process that existed outside normal causality. And whatever had done it had understood her setup well enough to recreate it almost perfectly, suggesting observation and intelligence and intention. She still camps, still does field work for her research, but she's never gone back to that specific area of Green Mountain National Forest. She can't bring herself to return to the split boulder, to the site where something studied her camp and then copied it in her absence. The trail camera images are stored on her computer in a folder she opens sometimes late at night, when sleep won't come, and she needs to remind herself that this really happened. They're evidence of something impossible, proof that challenges every assumption she'd made about how the world works. Her academic training tells her there must be an explanation, some principle of physics or psychology she's missing. But her lived experience tells her that sometimes we encounter things that exist outside our frameworks of understanding, things that operate by rules we haven't discovered and maybe never will. The worst part isn't the fear, though she still feels uneasy when camping alone. The worst part is the questions. Who or what was watching her long enough to memorize her camp setup? Why did they recreate it with such precision but get the details reversed? Was it an attempt at communication, at contact, at showing her something about the nature of reality? Or was it something simpler and stranger, an action we can't comprehend because we lack the context to understand it? She thinks about those 23 minutes often, about walking through the forest, gathering firewood, while something invisible worked in her campsite, touching her things, rearranging her space. The intimacy of that violation disturbs her more than the impossibility of it. She's tried to talk about it with colleagues, framing it as a hypothetical or a thought experiment. But she can see the skepticism in their faces, the polite concern that suggests they think she's either lying or unwell. So she's stopped trying to share it. The experience exists now only in her memory, and in the photographic record no one else has seen. Sometimes she wonders if that was the point, if whatever happened that October evening was meant specifically for her, a demonstration or a message intended for an audience of one. But that suggests a level of personal attention that's somehow more disturbing than random chance. The idea that something in those woods picked her specifically, studied her specifically, and staged that impossible recreation for her to discover is worse than thinking it was just a strange coincidence. She looks at her gear differently now. Every item carries the memory of being touched by something she couldn't see. Her sleeping bag, her boots, her water bottle. They were all handled and manipulated during those missing minutes. All became part of something she still doesn't understand. They're contaminated by mystery, marked by an event that shouldn't have been possible. And whenever she sets up camp now, she finds herself wondering if it's happening again, if someone or something is watching and studying and preparing to rearrange everything the moment she turns away. That paranoia, that constant low-level unease, is perhaps the most lasting effect of that October evening. It's stolen something from her, not her safety or her sanity, but her confidence in the stability of physical reality. And once that confidence is gone, she's learned it's almost impossible to get back. Has your campsite ever felt wrong when you return to it? Like someone had been there, but nothing was obviously missing? Would you have stayed to investigate or packed up and left immediately? Drop your answer below. Antonio was 10 years old the summer his family took their canoe trip through the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. It was July of 1983, and his parents had been planning the trip for months, talking about it over dinner and spreading maps across the kitchen table to trace their route. His older sister was 13 and pretended to be too cool for family vacations, but even she seemed excited once they actually got there and saw the endless maze of lakes and islands stretching in every direction. They'd rented canoes and portage between waterways, carrying their gear through forests thick with mosquitoes and humidity, setting up camp on small islands where the only sounds were lapping water and bird calls. For a kid from the suburbs, it felt like traveling to another world, someplace wild and ancient, where the normal rules didn't quite apply. Their campsite on the third night was on a small island, maybe 2 acres total, covered in pine trees, and connected to nothing. The nearest land was visible across maybe 300 yards of dark water. Antonio's father had chosen it specifically because of the isolation, because it would give them a genuine wilderness experience without the risk of encountering other campers. They'd set up 2 tents, one for the parents and one for Antonio and his sister, and made dinner over a fire while the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples. His sister had complained about the bugs and the lack of a bathroom, but Antonio thought it was perfect. He felt like an explorer, like someone discovering territory no one had seen before, even though he knew plenty of people had camped on this exact island. He fell asleep easily that night, exhausted from paddling and portaging, lulled by the sound of small waves against the rocky shore. He didn't know what time it was when he woke up, only that it was still fully dark and something had pulled him from sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening, trying to figure out what had disturbed him. His sister was breathing steadily in her own sleeping bag, a few feet away, clearly still asleep. Outside the tent, he could hear his parents' tent, the rustle of nylon as someone shifted position. Normal sounds, nothing alarming. But something had woken him, and as he lay there in the darkness, he heard it again. Children laughing. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere out in the trees, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, kids were playing. He could hear their voices clearly, the high-pitched squeals and giggles of what sounded like a dozen children running around and having the time of their lives. It sounded like a playground at recess, like the chaos of kids completely absorbed in some game. Antonio's first thought was confusion. They were on an island. There was no one else here. They'd paddled around the entire perimeter when they'd arrived, and it was just forest and rock and their campsite. No other tents, no other people. So where were these kids, and what were they doing out in the woods in the middle of the night? He listened more carefully, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The laughter had that quality of genuine joy, the unself-conscious happiness of children playing without any adult supervision or structure. He could hear running footsteps, could hear voices calling to each other, though he couldn't make out specific words. It sounded exactly like the games he played with his friends back home, tag or hide and seek, or one of those games that doesn't really have rules, just kids chasing each other and making up reasons to run and yell. Part of him wanted to go join them. It sounded fun, and he was bored lying in his sleeping bag, but something held him back, some instinct that told him to stay put and just listen. Then he heard his own voice. Clear and distinct among the other children's voices, he heard himself laughing and calling out. The words were muffled by distance, but the voice was unmistakably his. He recognized it the way you recognize a recording of yourself. That strange combination of familiar and foreign. He was hearing himself playing out there in the dark forest with children who shouldn't exist. Antonio froze completely, not even breathing, listening to himself having fun somewhere outside the tent. The impossibility of it didn't fully register in his 10-year-old mind, but the wrongness of it did. He knew with absolute certainty that he was inside the tent, lying in his sleeping bag, not moving. But he could hear himself out there, running and laughing with the others. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 10 or 15 minutes. The children played their invisible game, running through the forest in the darkness, and his own voice was part of the chorus. He wanted to wake his sister, wanted to ask if she heard it too, but he couldn't make himself move or speak. He just lay there, paralyzed by a fear he didn't fully understand, listening to an impossible version of himself play in the woods. Eventually, gradually, the sounds faded. The laughter grew quieter, the footsteps more distant, until finally there was only the normal silence of the forest at night. Antonio stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the dim shape of the tent ceiling, trying to convince himself he'd been dreaming. But when morning came and they all emerged from their tents into the bright July sunshine, his mother noticed something immediately. She asked Antonio why his shoes were outside the tent, and there was concern in her voice. He looked where she was pointing and saw his sneakers sitting on the ground a few feet from the tent entrance. They were wet and muddy, the white canvas sides stained with dirt and what looked like pine needles stuck to the soles. His mother picked them up, examined them with a frown, and asked again how they'd gotten outside. Antonio insisted he didn't know, that he'd left them in the tent when he went to sleep. His sister confirmed she hadn't seen him leave during the night, that he'd been in his sleeping bag the whole time as far as she knew. His mother held up the shoes, showing him the mud, and that's when the real fear hit him, because he was wearing those shoes. He looked down at his feet and saw his sneakers, the same white canvas with the same dirt stains, the same pine needles stuck to the rubber. His mother was holding them, but he was wearing them. That shouldn't be possible. His father came over to see what the confusion was about, and Antonio watched his parents exchange the kind of look adults share when something doesn't make sense, but they're trying not to alarm the children. His mother set the shoes down carefully, and Antonio looked back and forth between the shoes on the ground and the shoes on his feet. They were identical, down to the scuff marks and the way the laces were tied. His father suggested maybe they'd brought an extra pair and forgotten, though even as he said it, the explanation sounded weak. They hadn't brought extra shoes. They'd been careful about weight and space in the canoes, packing only what they absolutely needed. Antonio knew he'd only brought one pair of sneakers, the ones he was wearing. But here was another pair, muddy and wet like they'd been worn through the forest in the darkness. His mother picked them up again, turned them over, and her face went pale. She called his father over and showed him something. Antonio couldn't see what, but he heard his father's sharp intake of breath. They packed up camp quickly after that, much faster than they'd planned. His parents said they'd decided to cut the trip short, that they wanted to get back earlier than originally scheduled. But Antonio could see the tension in their movements, could hear the urgent tone in their whispered conversations when they thought the kids weren't listening. His sister complained about leaving early, but Antonio was secretly relieved. He wanted off this island, wanted away from whatever had happened in the night. As they loaded the canoes and paddled away, he kept looking back at their campsite, half expecting to see children emerge from the trees. But the island remained empty, just rocks and pines and the smoldering remains of their morning fire. They didn't talk about it during the paddle back to civilization. The family fell into an unusual silence, even his normally chatty sister seeming subdued. It wasn't until they were in the car, driving away from the Boundary Waters and back toward their normal life, that Antonio's mother brought it up. She asked him very carefully if he remembered anything strange from the night before. He told her about the children playing, about hearing his own voice among theirs. She and his father exchanged another look, and his father pulled the car over at a rest stop. They all got out and stood in the parking lot. And that's when his parents told him and his sister what they'd seen on the shoes. The shoes that had been outside the tent, the muddy ones his mother had picked up, had Antonio's initials inside them. His mother had written his initials in permanent marker on the inside tongue of his sneakers before the trip, a habit she had for all their clothes and gear to keep track of things. The shoes that were outside the tent had those initials, but so did the shoes Antonio was wearing. Both pairs were marked as his. Both were the exact same size and brand. Both had the same wear patterns and stains. His mother asked him again, more seriously this time, if he'd left the tent during the night. He swore he hadn't, that he'd stayed in his sleeping bag the whole time after hearing the children. His sister backed him up, insisting she would have noticed if he'd moved around that much. His father suggested they throw away the muddy shoes, just leave them at the rest stop and forget about them. But his mother said no, they should keep them, though she couldn't articulate why. So they put the extra pair in a plastic bag in the trunk, and they drove home with this impossible thing among their camping gear. Antonio tried not to think about it, tried to focus on getting back to his normal life and his friends in his own bedroom. But the memory of that night stayed with him, growing stranger and more unsettling the more time passed, and the more he understood about what should and shouldn't be possible. Years later, when Antonio was in high school, he asked his mother if she still had those shoes. She admitted she did, stored in a box in the basement with other things she couldn't bring herself to throw away, but didn't want to look at. They went down together and found the box, and Antonio held the shoes in his hands for the first time since he was 10. They were still muddy, still had pine needles stuck to them, still had his initials written in his mother's handwriting inside the tongue. He wore them around the basement for a minute, and they fit perfectly, just like the shoes he'd been wearing that morning in Minnesota. His mother told him something she'd never mentioned before. She said she'd heard the children too that night, had woken up to the sound of kids playing, and had assumed there must be another family camping nearby despite the island's isolation. She'd almost gone outside to investigate, to tell the other parents to keep their kids quieter, but something had stopped her. Some instinct that told her to stay in the tent and not look, not interfere, not acknowledge what she was hearing. Antonio is in his 50s now, and he still doesn't understand what happened that night in the Boundary Waters. He's researched the area, looking for legends or historical accounts that might explain it, but found nothing definitive. Just scattered stories of strange sounds in the forest, of people hearing things that shouldn't be there, of the occasional report of something impossible, like objects appearing or disappearing. The shoes are still in his possession, moved from his childhood home to his own house when his parents downsized. They're in his own basement now, in their own box, a physical reminder that sometimes reality glitches in ways we can't explain. What disturbs him most, even after all these years, isn't the mystery of the duplicate shoes or the impossibility of hearing his own voice while lying silent in his sleeping bag. It's the implication of what might have been happening if his voice was out there among the other children, if his shoes were walking through the muddy forest while his body lay in the tent. Then what was out there? Was it some version of him, some duplicate or projection that could exist separately from his physical body? Or was it something else entirely, something that could copy his voice and his appearance and his shoes, that could pretend to be him while playing invisible games in the darkness? He thinks about the children often, about their genuine-sounding laughter and the joy in their voices. They sounded so real, so alive, so engaged in whatever game they were playing. Were they real in some way he doesn't understand? Were they ghosts or echoes, or something from a different layer of reality that sometimes overlaps with ours? Or were they something stranger, something without a good name or category, something that exists in forests and wild places and occasionally reveals itself to people who happen to be in the right place at the wrong time? He doesn't have answers, just memories of being 10 years old and hearing himself play in the woods while knowing with absolute certainty that he wasn't moving, that he was lying terrified in his sleeping bag, listening to something impossible unfold in the darkness outside his tent. His own children are grown now, and sometimes they ask about family camping trips and why he never took them to places like the Boundary Waters. He makes excuses about work and time and the expense of that kind of vacation. But the real reason is simpler. He's afraid of what they might hear in the night, of what might walk around with their voices and leave their shoes muddy outside the tent. Some experiences, he's learned, are too strange and too disturbing to risk repeating, even decades later when the people involved have changed and the memories have faded. Some places hold mysteries that don't want to be solved, that exist specifically to remind us how little we actually understand about the world we live in. And sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, he thinks he can hear children laughing somewhere in the distance. And one of those voices sounds exactly like his did when he was 10 years old. When you were a child, did you ever hear something at night that adults couldn't explain away? If you heard your own voice coming from outside while knowing you were lying still inside, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments. Emmanuel and Haven had been together for 3 years, and camping had become their way of reconnecting when life got too hectic. Both worked demanding jobs in the tech industry around Seattle, and they'd learned that getting away from screens and connectivity was essential for maintaining their relationship. This particular trip to Gifford Pinchot National Forest in June was supposed to be a celebration of sorts. Emmanuel had just been promoted. Haven had finished a major project that had consumed 6 months of her life, and they both desperately needed to decompress. They'd chosen an established campsite in old-growth forest, the kind of place where the trees were so massive and ancient that standing among them felt like being in a cathedral. The Forest Service road that led to their site was rough but passable, and by late afternoon, they had their tent set up and a fire going. The evening was perfect in that specific Pacific Northwest way, cool but not cold, with filtered sunlight creating moving patterns through the canopy overhead. They cooked dinner, drank wine from a box, and talked about everything and nothing the way couples do when they're relaxed and happy. Haven mentioned she'd been thinking about proposing, and Emmanuel laughed because he'd been thinking the same thing. They decided to table that conversation for later, to just enjoy being together without making any big decisions. As darkness fell, they stayed by the fire, watching sparks rise into the black sky between the trees. Around 10, they climbed into their tent, zipped themselves into their sleeping bags, and fell asleep with the comfortable ease of people who'd shared a tent many times before. Emmanuel woke first, though he couldn't immediately say why. The tent was dark, the forest outside quiet. Haven was asleep beside him, her breathing steady and deep. He lay there trying to figure out what had pulled him from sleep, and that's when he heard it. A sound like air being forced through a massive pipe or tunnel, a deep rhythmic whooshing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was loud enough that he felt it in his chest, a physical vibration that pulsed in time with the sound. He reached over and shook Haven awake, pressing his hand over her mouth before she could speak. Her eyes opened, confused and slightly annoyed, but then she heard it too, and her expression changed to mirror his own bewilderment. They lay there, listening to this impossible sound fill the forest around them. It had a rhythm to it, a regular pattern like breathing or machinery, but far too large for either explanation to make sense. The whooshing would build, reaching a peak of volume that made the tent walls vibrate, then fade slightly before building again. It was relentless and overwhelming, drowning out every other sound. Emmanuel couldn't hear the normal forest noises anymore, couldn't hear Haven, even though she was right next to him trying to say something. The sound was too loud, too pervasive, filling every available space with its presence. Haven grabbed her phone and checked the time. 3:17 in the morning. She tried to pull up a map or search for information about the area, but there was no signal out here. Emmanuel unzipped the tent entrance slightly and looked outside, half expecting to see some kind of industrial equipment or aircraft, something that could account for the noise. But the forest looked exactly as it had when they'd gone to sleep. Trees, darkness, the faint glow of coals from their fire. Nothing that could produce this sound. He zipped the tent back up and looked at Haven, seeing his own confusion and growing fear reflected in her face. The sound continued without variation, that same deep whooshing pulse repeating over and over. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2 hours. They couldn't sleep through it, couldn't ignore it, couldn't do anything but lie there and endure it. Haven started crying at one point, not from fear exactly, but from the overwhelming sensory assault of it. The vibration in her chest wouldn't stop, and she said it felt like something was trying to shake her apart from the inside. Emmanuel held her, though he could barely feel his own arms through the persistent thrumming. They both kept checking Haven's phone, watching time crawl forward with agonizing slowness, waiting for sunrise and hoping the sound would stop. Around 5:30, with the first hints of dawn starting to lighten the sky, the sound changed. It began to fade, not gradually, but in distinct steps, like something was being powered down in stages. The volume decreased, the vibration lessened, and finally, just as the forest began to fill with the normal sounds of morning birds, it stopped completely. The silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the noise had been. Emmanuel and Haven lay in their tent, not speaking, just listening to the absence of the sound and trying to process what they'd just experienced. They emerged from the tent into a forest that looked completely normal and innocent in the early morning light. Birds were singing, a light breeze moved through the canopy. Their campsite was undisturbed. It was as if nothing had happened. But both of them were exhausted and shaken, their eyes red from lack of sleep, their bodies tense from hours of enduring that relentless vibration. They made coffee without discussing whether to stay or leave, both operating on autopilot while their minds tried to make sense of the night. It was Haven who suggested talking to other campers. There had been at least 2 other occupied sites within a half-mile of theirs, close enough that surely those people had heard the same thing. They walked down the Forest Service road, past their own site toward where they'd seen another tent the previous day. The campsite was occupied, a young couple who were making breakfast and looked remarkably well rested. Emmanuel asked if they'd heard anything unusual during the night, trying to keep his voice casual. The couple looked at each other and shook their heads. They'd slept great, hadn't heard a thing. It was so quiet out here, the guy said. Way better than the city. Emmanuel and Haven thanked them and moved on. The next campsite had a family, parents with 2 kids who were running around while their father packed up gear. Haven asked the same question, framing it as curiosity about local wildlife or weather phenomena. The mother said it had been a perfectly quiet night that the kids had slept through until morning without waking once. She asked if Emmanuel and Haven had heard something, and when they tried to describe the sound, the mother looked concerned and suggested maybe there was a highway or industrial facility nearby that created noise at night. But they all knew there wasn't. They were miles from any road larger than the dirt track they'd driven in on, miles from any kind of industrial development. They found one more occupied campsite, this one with 3 men who looked like they were on a fishing trip. Same question, same answer. No one had heard anything unusual. The night had been quiet and uneventful. Emmanuel and Haven walked back to their own site in silence, both trying to process the impossibility of what they were learning. They'd experienced something so loud it had vibrated their bodies for hours, something that had filled the entire forest with sound. But apparently, no one else had heard it. Either everyone was lying, which seemed unlikely and pointless, or somehow the sound had been localized just to their campsite. Neither explanation made any sense. They broke camp and drove to the nearest ranger station, a small facility about 20 miles away. The ranger on duty was a man in his 40s who listened to their description with an expression that started as polite interest and slowly shifted to something more complicated. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked them to describe the sound again, in as much detail as possible. Emmanuel did his best, talking about the whooshing quality, the rhythmic pulsing, the physical vibration, the way it had started suddenly and stopped at dawn. The ranger nodded slowly, made some notes, and then asked where exactly they'd been camped. When they pointed it out on the map, his expression changed again. He excused himself and went into a back office, returning a few minutes later with what looked like an incident log. He explained that they weren't the first people to report something like this in that general area. Over the past 15 years, there had been 8 documented reports of campers hearing similar sounds. Always in June, always lasting from around 3 in the morning until dawn, always described as a loud whooshing or rushing noise that created physical vibration, always experienced by only one campsite at a time, even when there were other campers nearby who heard nothing. Haven asked what caused it, and the ranger said he didn't know. The Forest Service had investigated after the 3rd report, bringing in acoustic experts and monitoring equipment. They'd set up recording devices throughout the area and waited, but the sound never occurred while the equipment was there, or if it did, the equipment didn't capture it. The investigations had been inconclusive, the reports had continued sporadically, and eventually the Forest Service had stopped actively trying to explain it. The ranger's tone suggested he believed them, that he'd probably heard similar stories enough times to accept that something genuinely strange happened in that area. But he also couldn't offer any explanation or solution. Emmanuel asked if anyone had been hurt, and the ranger said no. The reports were consistent in describing the experience as disturbing and exhausting, but not dangerous. People left feeling shaken and confused, much like Emmanuel and Haven clearly felt now, but there had been no injuries or lasting harm beyond the psychological impact of experiencing something that shouldn't exist. The ranger suggested they file a formal report, which Haven did, describing everything in detail. As they were leaving, the ranger told them something that stuck with both of them. He said that in his personal opinion, there were things in old growth forests that we didn't understand, phenomena that existed outside our current scientific frameworks. He didn't offer this as an official Forest Service position, just as one person's speculation to another, but it was clear he believed it. They drove back to Seattle that afternoon, neither of them wanting to spend another night anywhere near that forest. The experience had fundamentally changed what should have been a relaxing celebration into something that raised questions they couldn't answer. Haven became somewhat obsessed with it over the following weeks, researching acoustic phenomena and geological processes that might explain a sound like they'd heard. She found plenty of interesting information about how sound travels through forests, about infrasound and its effects on human perception, about various natural processes that can create unusual noises, but nothing that fit their specific experience. Nothing that could account for a sound that loud and that sustained that somehow affected only one campsite while leaving nearby campers completely undisturbed. Emmanuel took a different approach. He accepted that they'd experienced something unexplainable and tried to move on. But he found he couldn't quite manage it. The memory of that vibration in his chest, of that relentless whooshing sound, wouldn't fade the way normal memories do. It stayed vivid and immediate, like something that had happened hours ago rather than weeks or months. He'd wake up sometimes feeling the echo of it, that deep rhythmic pulse, and have to remind himself he was in his apartment in Seattle, not in a tent in the forest. The experience had left a mark on him that he couldn't quite articulate, a sense that reality was less stable than he'd believed, that there were phenomena operating in the world that had nothing to do with human understanding or experience. They did eventually get engaged about 6 months after the camping trip, but when they talked about wedding plans and future vacations, camping was conspicuously absent from their discussions. Haven suggested a beach resort. Emmanuel proposed a European city tour. They considered all kinds of options that kept them far from old-growth forests and unexplained sounds. Neither of them explicitly said they were avoiding camping, but they both knew. The experience had taken something from them, not their love of nature exactly, but their comfort with it. They'd learned that there were things out there that could fill a forest with sound while remaining invisible and inexplicable, things that could vibrate your chest and keep you awake for hours, and then vanish with the sunrise as if they'd never existed at all. Emmanuel still wonders sometimes what they heard that night. Was it some kind of natural phenomenon, a perfect storm of geological and atmospheric conditions that created that specific sound? Was it something technological, some military or research project happening in frequencies most people couldn't hear, but that affected them specifically? Or was it something else entirely? Something that exists in old forests for reasons we can't fathom. Something that occasionally reveals itself to people unlucky or lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. He doesn't have answers, just memories of a sound that shouldn't exist, and the knowledge that it's still out there, waiting in that section of forest for the next people who happen to camp in the wrong spot on the wrong night in June. Have you ever heard a sound so loud and strange that you questioned whether it was even real? If other campers nearby claimed they heard nothing, would you trust your own experience or think you'd imagined it? Drop your thoughts below. Miguel had spent 2 decades working as a wildlife biologist in Montana, and he thought he'd seen pretty much everything the backcountry could throw at him. He'd tracked grizzlies, documented wolf populations, spent weeks at a time alone in terrain most people would consider genuinely dangerous. His expertise was respected enough that he consulted for national parks and wildlife management agencies across the West. So when he planned a solo backpacking trip through Glacier National Park in September, it was with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He'd hiked these mountains dozens of times, understood animal behavior better than most people, and had protocols for every potential wildlife encounter. The trip was supposed to be straightforward. 3 days of hiking and observation in an area he'd worked in multiple times before. The first day went exactly as planned. He covered good distance, set up camp in a designated backcountry site, made dinner, and settled in for the night. The weather was perfect for September, cool but not cold, with clear skies that promised good visibility for the wildlife observation he'd planned for the next day. He fell asleep easily, the kind of deep rest that comes from physical exertion and the particular silence of mountain wilderness. But he woke in the early hours of the second morning with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't sound or movement that had disturbed him, just a sense that something was off. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the darkness, and realized what was bothering him. He felt watched. Miguel had experienced this sensation before, usually when there was actually something nearby. A deer moving through camp, a fox investigating his food storage, once memorably a black bear that had wandered within 20 feet of his tent. But this felt different. The attention felt focused and sustained in a way animal curiosity usually wasn't. He listened carefully for any sounds that might explain the feeling, but heard nothing beyond the normal ambient noise of a mountain night. Still, the sensation persisted. Something was out there, and it was paying attention to him specifically. He told himself it was probably nothing, just his subconscious picking up on some subtle environmental cue his conscious mind hadn't identified, but he didn't fall back asleep for over an hour, and when he finally did, his rest was light and interrupted. The next day he started noticing things, small disturbances that individually meant nothing but that accumulated into a pattern. Vegetation that looked like something large had pushed through it recently, displaced rocks along the trail he was following, a sense that he was moving through space something else had just vacated. He stopped several times to scan the area with his binoculars, looking for whatever was creating these signs, but he saw nothing. No animals, no other hikers, nothing that could account for the traces he was finding. His professional instincts told him something was tracking him, moving parallel to his route, staying just out of sight. But his experience with wildlife told him this didn't match any normal animal behavior pattern. By mid-afternoon, he was genuinely uneasy. The feeling of being watched had intensified throughout the day, and the traces he was finding suggested something was deliberately staying close to him without revealing itself. He'd dealt with curious animals before, had been followed by wolves and mountain lions, had navigated dozens of situations where wildlife had shown interest in his presence. But those encounters had followed predictable patterns. Animals either approached to investigate and then lost interest, or they kept their distance and eventually moved on. They didn't track humans for hours while remaining completely hidden. That suggested intelligence and intention beyond what he'd expect from even the most curious predator. He made camp earlier than planned, choosing a site with good visibility in all directions. He set up his tent, secured his food in a bare canister, and built a fire that he kept larger than necessary. The light and smoke would deter most animals, and he wanted whatever was out there to know exactly where he was. Part of him hoped being obvious about his location would either draw the follower into view or convince it to move on. Instead, as darkness fell, the sense of being observed grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the reach of his firelight, watching and waiting. Around 10, he climbed into his tent but didn't zip it completely closed. He wanted to be able to hear clearly, wanted to maintain awareness of his surroundings. He lay in his sleeping bag with his headlamp and knife within easy reach, every sense straining for information about what was out there. An hour passed, then 2. The fire outside burned down to coals. The forest settled into its nighttime rhythms. And then he heard movement, the distinctive sound of something large moving through the undergrowth with deliberate slowness. Miguel's professional assessment kicked in automatically. Weight distribution suggested something heavy, probably over 200 pounds. The movement pattern was careful and controlled, each step placed with consideration, not the random wandering of a foraging bear or the purposeful stride of a traveling elk. This was something moving with specific intent toward his campsite. He grabbed his headlamp but didn't turn it on yet, listening and trying to build a mental map of where the sounds were coming from. The movement circled his campsite at a consistent distance, maybe 30 or 40 feet out. It completed one full circuit, then another. This wasn't investigation or curiosity. This was surveillance. He turned on his headlamp and pointed it toward where he'd last heard movement. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and rocks and undergrowth. Nothing else. No eyes reflecting back at him, no shape of an animal, no explanation for the sounds he'd just heard. He called out, identifying himself as a wildlife biologist and asking if anyone was out there. His voice sounded strange in the mountain silence, too small and human against the vast darkness. No response. But the movement sounds had stopped when he'd turned on the light. Whatever was out there had frozen in place, or retreated, or simply stopped existing in any way his senses could detect. Miguel spent the rest of that night awake and alert, his headlamps sweeping the perimeter of his campsite every few minutes. He didn't hear the circling movement again, but the feeling of being watched never faded. As a biologist, he tried to approach this clinically, to catalog what he was observing and form hypotheses. But his observations didn't fit any hypothesis he could construct. No known animal would behave this way. Mountain lions were the most likely to follow humans, but they didn't circle campsites for hours, and they certainly didn't stop moving the moment light hit their location without creating any further sound of retreat. At first light, he examined the area where he'd heard the movement. The ground was covered in pine needles and scattered rocks. Not ideal for tracks, but not impossible either. He found disturbances, places where something had definitely moved through, but no clear prints. No distinctive paw shapes or hoof marks. Just areas where the ground cover had been displaced by weight and passage. He photographed everything, documented the patterns, and came to a disturbing conclusion. Whatever had circled his camp was either extraordinarily good at moving without leaving clear tracks, or it was something he simply didn't have the knowledge to identify. The third day of his trip was supposed to include several more miles of hiking and observation. Instead, Miguel made the decision to head out. His professional pride bristled at the idea of cutting a trip short because he felt spooked, but his survival instincts were louder. Something in these mountains was tracking him with sustained focus, demonstrating intelligence and capability that didn't match any wildlife he knew. Staying to investigate further felt less like scientific curiosity and more like recklessness. He packed his gear and started the hike back toward the trailhead, moving faster than he normally would, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite justify but couldn't ignore. The follower came with him. He couldn't see it, couldn't get a clear sense of where it was, but he knew it was there. The feeling of attention never faded. Several times he stopped abruptly and spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was behind him. But there was never anything visible, just empty trail and forest. He tried varying his pace, stopping for extended periods, doubling back on his route. Nothing changed the basic fact that something was tracking him, and had been for almost 3 full days. It was early afternoon when he finally reached the trailhead and his vehicle. The relief he felt seeing his truck was disproportionate to the situation, and he recognized it as a fear response his rational mind hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. He'd been genuinely frightened in a way that rarely happened anymore, not by anything he'd seen, but by the sustained presence of something that remained inexplicable despite all his expertise. He loaded his gear into the truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and only then allowed himself to sit still and try to process what had happened. He filed a report with the Park Service when he got back to cell service, detailing his experience as clinically as possible. He described the timeline, the patterns he'd observed, the evidence he'd documented. He framed it as a potentially significant wildlife behavior observation, because that was the language he knew how to use. But the ranger he spoke to, a woman he'd worked with on previous projects, heard something in his voice that made her ask directly what he thought had been following him. Miguel told her honestly that he didn't know, and that bothered him more than the experience itself. In 20 years of wildlife biology, he'd always been able to identify what he was observing. This was the first time he'd encountered something that existed outside his framework of knowledge. The ranger told him there had been other reports over the years from that general area. Not many, and not consistent enough to establish a pattern, but enough that she wasn't surprised by what he was describing. Experienced outdoors people, often with wildlife backgrounds similar to Miguel's, reporting a sense of being followed by something they could never observe directly. The reports always included the same elements he'd described: the sustained attention, the intelligent circling, the way the presence seemed to react to human awareness by becoming even more hidden. None of the reports had ever resulted in any kind of confrontation or harm. Whatever was doing the following seemed content to observe without interfering, but that almost made it more disturbing because it suggested purpose without providing any insight into what that purpose might be. Miguel went back to his normal work after the trip, conducting surveys and writing reports and consulting on wildlife management issues. But the experience had changed something fundamental in how he approached the wilderness. He'd spent his career believing that understanding came from observation and analysis, that any natural phenomenon could be explained given enough data and the right framework. But this had challenged that belief in a way he was still processing months later. He'd been followed for 3 days by something that demonstrated clear intelligence and capability, something that left physical evidence of its passage, something that existed in the same physical space he occupied, but he couldn't identify it, couldn't categorize it, couldn't fit it into any system of knowledge he'd spent 20 years building. He still goes into the backcountry for work, but he doesn't do solo trips anymore. Not because he's afraid of being harmed, the follower had never demonstrated any aggressive intent, but because experiencing that kind of sustained attention from something unknown had revealed a vulnerability he hadn't previously acknowledged. The wilderness wasn't just a system to be understood and navigated. It was also home to things that operated outside human frameworks, that had their own purposes and patterns that might never align with human understanding. Being followed had taught him humility in a way decades of professional work hadn't. It had shown him that expertise had limits, that knowledge could take you only so far when confronted with something genuinely outside your experience. He thinks about it often, especially when he's out on other projects in similar terrain. He wonders if the follower is still out there, still tracking people through those mountains for reasons it will never explain. He wonders if it's unique or if there are others like it, and if experienced outdoors people across the country have had similar experiences but lack the framework to discuss them without sounding irrational. Mostly, though, he wonders what it wanted. Not food. He'd secured that properly, and it had never attempted to access it. Not territory. It could have driven him away much more directly. It seemed to want observation, to study him the way he'd spent his career studying wildlife. That reversal of roles, being the observed rather than the observer, had been profoundly unsettling. It suggested that the things we study in the wilderness might sometimes study us back. With intelligence and purpose we can't comprehend because we've never imagined ourselves as the subject rather than the scientist. As a wildlife expert, what would you do if you were being stalked by something that didn't match any known animal behavior pattern? Would you stay to investigate or leave immediately? Share your response below. Maxwell, Tatum, Barrett, and Gray had been friends since college, and even though they'd all ended up in different cities after graduation, they made a point of getting together at least once a year for a camping trip. This year, they'd chosen Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, drawn by photos of pristine lakes and the promise of truly remote backcountry. They were all in their late 20s now, working jobs that kept them chained to computers most of the time, and the prospect of a long weekend paddling canoes and sleeping under stars felt like exactly what they needed. They'd arrived at the park on a Thursday in August, rented canoes, and paddled out to a lakeside campsite that required 2 hours of travel from the nearest access point. The isolation was part of the appeal. No cell service, no other campers visible, just the four of them and a pristine lake surrounded by dense forest. They'd set up camp efficiently, the product of years of similar trips together, and spent the afternoons swimming and exploring the shoreline near their site. The water was cold and incredibly clear, the kind of lake where you could see 20 feet down to rocks and submerged logs. Gray, who'd taken up photography as a hobby, spent an hour trying to capture the way light moved through the forest canopy and reflected off the water. Tatum insisted on cooking an elaborate camping meal that involved way too many ingredients and resulted in way too many dishes, but tasted incredible. Barrett kept a running commentary of jokes and observations that had them all laughing. Maxwell felt grateful for these friendships, for people who'd known him long enough that he didn't have to pretend or perform, could just exist comfortably in their company. As evening settled in, they built a fire and sat around it talking the way they always did, catching up on work drama and relationship updates and all the small details of life that accumulated between these annual trips. Around 10, they were starting to consider heading to their tents when Gray noticed something in the water. He pointed toward the lake, maybe 30 feet from shore, and asked if anyone else saw it. They all turned to look, and there it was, a light, bright and distinct, moving underwater. It wasn't a reflection, wasn't a flashlight from another campsite. It was coming from beneath the surface, a source of illumination that moved with clear purpose and direction. Maxwell stood up and walked to the water's edge to get a better view. The light was maybe 10 or 15 feet below the surface, circular and steady, moving parallel to their shoreline. It had an intensity that seemed wrong for that depth, too bright to be a flashlight or any kind of conventional light source he could think of. The others joined him at the water's edge, all four of them, standing there, watching this impossible thing move through the lake. Barrett suggested maybe it was a submarine or some kind of research vessel, but they all knew that. Didn't make sense. The lake wasn't that deep near shore, and besides, there'd been no sound of motors or machinery, no disturbance on the water's surface. The light continued its path, moving slowly and deliberately. It seemed to be following the contour of their campsite's shoreline, like it was mapping the boundary between land and water. After completing what looked like a full circuit of their immediate area, it moved toward the center of the lake. They watched it grow smaller and dimmer as it descended, sinking deeper into water that the park information had told them was over 200 feet deep in places. Eventually, it vanished completely, swallowed by depth and darkness, leaving the four of them standing at the water's edge trying to make sense of what they'd just observed. They spent the next 20 minutes debating what it could have been. Gray suggested bioluminescence, but none of them had heard of freshwater organisms that created light that bright, or moved that deliberately. Tatum wondered if it could be some kind of geological phenomenon, minerals or gases creating illumination, but couldn't articulate how that would work. Barrett was convinced it had to be human-made, maybe divers with specialized equipment doing research, though that didn't explain the lack of boats or support teams or any of the infrastructure you'd expect for that kind of operation. Maxwell didn't offer theories, just stood at the shore looking at the spot where the light had disappeared, feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The strangest part came when they started comparing notes about what they'd actually seen. Gray described the light as bright white, steady and unwavering like an LED. Tatum insisted it had been blue, maybe cyan, with a quality that reminded her of certain deep-sea footage she'd watched. Barrett said it had pulsed, not rapidly, but in a slow rhythm, like breathing or a heartbeat. Maxwell was certain it had been steady, no pulsing at all, with a warmth to it that suggested incandescent light rather than LED. They went back and forth, each absolutely certain of their own description, unable to reconcile the differences. It wasn't like they were describing similar things from different perspectives. They were describing fundamentally different characteristics, as if they'd each seen a different light. That realization bothered Maxwell more than the initial sighting. They'd all been standing together, looking at the same thing, and somehow their brains had processed completely different visual information. Gray pulled out his camera and checked the photos he'd been taking throughout the evening, hoping he'd accidentally captured the light. The photos showed the lake, the campsite, the fire, all perfectly normal. The timestamp confirmed he'd been taking pictures during the minutes when the light had been visible. But in the digital images, there was no light in the water. Just darkness, where they'd all seen illumination. He scrolled through frame after frame, and every image showed an empty lake with no trace of what they'd witnessed. They tried taking more photos, pointing Barrett's phone and Gray's camera at the water, trying to capture anything unusual. But the lake remained stubbornly normal in every image. Whatever they'd seen either didn't register on digital sensors or existed in a way that couldn't be photographed. That impossibility sat heavy among them, killing the relaxed mood of the evening. These were rational people. All of them had technical jobs that required logical thinking and problem-solving. But they'd just witnessed something that defied explanation and left them with more questions than observations. They eventually went to their tents, though Maxwell suspected none of them would sleep well. He lay in his sleeping bag listening to the water lap against the shore, replaying what he'd seen and trying to find some explanation that made sense. The movement had been too purposeful to be random. The light had circled their campsite like it was examining their location, like something was investigating or surveying, but investigating for what purpose, and why would different people perceive it differently? He thought about optical illusions, about how the brain fills in details and makes assumptions. But this was beyond that. This was 4 people with completely contradictory descriptions of something they'd all watched simultaneously. Morning came with the kind of brilliant sunshine that makes everything seem more manageable. They made coffee and breakfast, and in the bright daylight, the previous night's experience took on an almost dreamlike quality. Barrett joked that they'd probably all been tired and had convinced each other they'd seen something that wasn't there, but none of them really believed that. The memory was too clear, too specific, too detailed. They'd seen something real, even if they couldn't agree on what it had looked like or understand why it couldn't be photographed. They spent the day trying to enjoy their camping trip, but the lake had taken on a different character. Every time Maxwell looked at it, he found himself searching the water for any sign of the light. The others were doing the same thing. He could tell by how often their gazes drifted to the water, how they'd stop mid-conversation to stare at the depths. Around mid-afternoon, Tatum suggested they paddle out to where the light had descended to see if there was anything visible from directly above that spot. It took some debate, but eventually they all agreed. The curiosity was too strong to ignore. They loaded into 2 canoes and paddled toward the center of the lake, using Gray's GPS to mark approximately where they'd seen the light disappear. The water beneath them was dark and impenetrable, giving no hint of what might exist in its depths. They floated there for maybe 30 minutes, looking down, seeing nothing but their own reflections and the occasional fish. Barrett dropped a weighted line to try to gauge the depth, and it went down over 100 feet before hitting bottom. Maxwell felt a strange vertigo looking at that much water beneath them, thinking about the light moving through those depths with apparent ease and purpose. They paddled back to shore without incident, but the day had taken on a tense quality that none of them could quite shake. They made dinner, attempted conversation that kept trailing off, and built another fire as evening approached. There was an unspoken agreement that they'd watch for the light again, that maybe seeing it a second time would provide clarity or answers. As darkness fell, they sat at the water's edge, 4 friends who'd known each other for years, now united by something inexplicable they'd witnessed together. The light appeared again, around the same time as the previous night, maybe 15 minutes earlier. This time they were watching for it, and they saw it emerge from the deeper water and move toward their shoreline with the same deliberate purpose. It circled again, making its slow circuit of their campsite boundary. And once again, when they compared notes afterward, their descriptions didn't match. Gray saw it pulsing this time. Tatum said it was steady. Maxwell swore it was brighter than the night before. Barrett thought it was dimmer. They couldn't even agree on the color, with assessments ranging from white to blue to something Gray described as almost purple. They tried everything they could think of to document it. Photos, videos, even Barrett's voice recorder in case there was any sound they weren't consciously hearing. Nothing worked. Every piece of technology showed an empty lake. The light existed only in their direct perception, visible to their eyes, but invisible to their devices. It completed its survey of their location, descended back to the depths, and vanished. They sat in silence after it left, the magnitude of what they were experiencing finally settling in. This wasn't just an unexplained phenomenon. This was something that seemed to operate outside the normal rules of perception and documentation. Maxwell had a thought that he hesitated to voice, but eventually shared. What if the light was intelligent? What if it was aware of them watching it, and was allowing itself to be seen for some purpose they couldn't understand? The others considered this quietly. It felt like a leap from unexplained natural phenomenon to something with awareness and intent. But the alternative explanations weren't working. Natural phenomena didn't examine campsites with that kind of methodical attention. They didn't return on successive nights to the same location. And they didn't somehow prevent themselves from being captured by cameras while remaining visible to human eyes. They debated leaving early, cutting their trip short, and heading back to civilization where things made sense. But there was also a strange pull to stay, to see if the light would return a third night to try to understand more about what they were witnessing. They compromised by agreeing to stay one more night, and if the light appeared again, they'd attempt to interact with it somehow. The plan was vague, none of them quite sure what interaction would even mean in this context, but the passive observation was starting to feel insufficient. If this thing was intelligent, if it was studying them the way they were studying it, maybe communication was possible. The third night, the light returned. By now, they'd been expecting it, had prepared themselves as much as possible for something that remained fundamentally inexplicable. It emerged from the depths and began its circuit, and this time Barrett waded into the water. Not far, just enough to be partially submerged, standing maybe 10 feet from shore. The light adjusted its path, moving toward him instead of following the shoreline. The others held their breath as it approached, coming within maybe 20 feet of where Barrett stood. He described it later as the most intense experience of attention he'd ever felt, like being examined by something that saw him completely, understood him in ways he didn't understand himself. The light hovered near Barrett for what felt like forever, but was probably closer to 2 minutes. Then it moved away, completed its circuit of the campsite, and descended. This time, as it sank toward the depths, they all saw it differently, but described one common element. It flashed once before, disappearing, a brief intensification of light that felt like acknowledgement or goodbye or communication of some kind. Then it was gone, and they were left standing at the edge of a dark lake in a remote park in Canada. 4 people who'd shared an experience that would connect them forever and that they'd never fully understand. They left the next morning, paddling back to the access point in silence. When they reached cellular service hours later, they each tried to search for explanations or similar reports. They found plenty of stories about lights in water, but nothing that matched the specifics of what they'd experienced. Nothing that explained the perception differences, the inability to photograph it, the sense of intelligence and purpose behind its movements. They stayed in touch more frequently after that trip, texting each other whenever they thought about the light or had new theories about what it might have been. Maxwell thinks about it constantly, not in an obsessive way, but as a persistent background question that surfaces whenever he's near water or looking at stars, or contemplating the limits of human understanding. They'd witnessed something that existed in the same physical space they occupied, that moved through water and light, that saw them and allowed itself to be seen. But it operated by rules they couldn't decode, existed in a way their technology couldn't capture, and left them with more questions than they'd ever be able to answer. He's grateful for the experience in a strange way. It's a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than the small corner of it we think we understand, that there are phenomena and intelligences sharing this planet with us that we might never fully comprehend, but that occasionally, for reasons unknown, choose to reveal themselves to those who happen to be watching. If you saw an underwater light that your camera couldn't capture, and your friends all described differently, would you wade in to get closer or stay on shore? Have you ever witnessed something with others that you couldn't agree on afterward? Tell us below. Nicholas worked as a paramedic in Boise, and the job had taught her to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly during emergencies, and to trust her training even when situations looked chaotic. She'd been doing it for 6 years, long enough that very little surprised her anymore. She'd seen medical crises of every variety, had talked people through their worst moments, had made life or death decisions in the back of ambulances speeding through traffic. That professional competence extended to her personal life, too. She was careful, prepared, methodical about safety. So when she planned a solo camping trip to Sawtooth National Forest in July, she approached it with the same attention to detail she brought to her work. She had quality gear, she'd filed her itinerary with friends, and she carried an emergency radio specifically designed for backcountry use. The radio was receive-only, a compact device that could pick up emergency broadcasts, weather alerts, and Forest Service communications, but had no transmission capability. It was meant purely for information, for staying aware of changing conditions or hazards while out of cell range. Nicholas had carried it on dozens of trips and had used it exactly twice, both times to get advance warning of incoming storms. It was a safety tool, nothing more. She'd never expected it to become the center of the most terrifying experience of her life. She'd hiked into a remote area of the Sawtooths, following trails that led deep into mountain terrain, where the nearest other humans were likely miles away. Her chosen campsite was in a small clearing surrounded by pines, with good sight lines and access to a stream for water. She set up her tent as the afternoon sun angled through the trees, filtering water, and organizing her gear with practiced efficiency. By evening, she had everything arranged exactly how she liked it. A small fire going, dinner cooking, the satisfaction of being competent and self-sufficient in a beautiful place. She ate while watching the light fade, made notes in the journal she kept of her outdoor experiences, and climbed into her tent around 10, feeling pleasantly tired and content. She woke suddenly just after 1 in the morning, pulled from sleep by a sound that took her a moment to identify. Her emergency radio was making noise, not the static hiss it usually produced when scanning for signals, but an actual voice, clear and distinct, speaking through the small speaker clipped to her pack near the tent entrance. She fumbled for her headlamp, clicked it on, and grabbed the radio. The voice was still speaking, calm and measured, and it was saying her name. "Nicholas," it said. "Nicholas, you need to listen carefully." Her first reaction was confusion more than fear. Emergency radios didn't work like this. They received broadcasts, public information sent to anyone listening. They didn't address specific people by name. And yet the voice was speaking directly to her, using her name repeatedly, like it was trying to get her attention. She checked the radio display, confirming what she already knew. Receive only. No way to transmit. No way anyone could use this device to speak to her personally. But the voice continued, and what it said next made her blood turn cold. The voice described her campsite in precise detail. It told her the color of her tent, the way she'd positioned it relative to the trees, what she was wearing. It mentioned the small tear in her sleeping bag that she'd been meaning to repair, the specific brand of her camp stove, the arrangement of her gear inside the tent. It knew things no one could possibly know unless they were looking directly at her, watching her right now in the darkness of her tent. The voice was male, or at least sounded male, with a flat affect that made it hard to gauge emotion or intent. It spoke slowly and clearly, as if reading from a script or describing something it was observing in real time. Nicholas felt panic rising but forced it down through sheer professional discipline. She needed to think clearly, to assess the situation logically. Someone was watching her. That was the only explanation for the level of detail in the descriptions. But how were they speaking through her radio? That wasn't possible with the technology she had, unless they were broadcasting on emergency frequencies, which was illegal and would be picked up by Forest Service monitoring systems. But the voice continued, and what it said next snapped her into a different kind of fear entirely. "They're coming," the voice said. "3 of them. They've been watching you since you arrived. They're going to search this area and they don't know you're here. Hide your light. Don't let them see you. They're coming now." The voice stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-word and leaving only silence. Nicholas sat frozen in her tent, her headlamp still on, her mind racing. This had to be a prank, some elaborate setup by people who wanted to scare solo campers. But the alternative, that this was a genuine warning, was too terrifying to ignore. She made a decision in seconds. She clicked off her headlamp, plunging herself into complete darkness. The silence stretched out, broken only by her own rapid breathing and the hammering of her heart. She strained to hear anything outside the tent, any sound that would tell her whether the warning was real or fabricated. Minutes passed. Nothing. She started to relax slightly, started to convince herself this had been a sick joke or a hallucination brought on by altitude or dehydration. Then she heard footsteps. Multiple people moving through the forest, not bothering to be quiet about it. They had flashlights, beams cutting through the darkness and occasionally illuminating the walls of her tent from outside. She could hear voices now, men talking to each other in tones too low for her to make out words. Nicholas pressed herself flat in her sleeping bag, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. The footsteps came closer, the lights sweeping across her campsite. She could hear them walking around the perimeter of her site, the crunch of their boots on pine needles and small branches. They were searching for something. That much was clear. The methodical way they moved, the way their lights probed every shadow, suggested they were looking for a specific thing or person. Her tent was dark and silent, and somehow they walked past it without stopping. The footsteps continued beyond her campsite, the lights moving away through the trees, the voices fading into distance. She stayed frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, listening to make sure they'd really gone. Her professional training kicked in, the same mental processes she used to stay calm during medical emergencies. She needed information. She needed to understand what had just happened and what her next move should be. The men had been real. That was undeniable. She'd heard them, seen their lights. But the warning had been real too, had come exactly when it needed to for her to hide in time, which meant someone or something had been watching both her and the men, had known they were coming, and had used her radio to warn her. The impossibility of that settled over her like a weight. Her radio had no transmission capability. She'd checked it when she bought it, had read the specifications multiple times. It could receive but not send, yet someone had transmitted to it, had spoken directly to her through a device that shouldn't allow that kind of communication. And they'd saved her. Whatever those men had been looking for, she'd been in danger, and the voice on the radio had protected her by giving her time to hide. The gratitude she felt was mixed with profound confusion and a fear that went deeper than the immediate threat. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat in her dark tent with the radio clutched in her hands, listening to the forest and jumping at every sound. As soon as the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, she packed her gear. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manage the zippers and buckles, but she forced herself to work methodically, to not leave anything behind. She needed to get out of these mountains, needed to get to a ranger station or somewhere with other people and answers. The hike back to the trailhead took 3 hours, and she moved faster than was safe, driven by fear and adrenaline and the desperate need to be anywhere but that campsite. When she reached her car, she sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine, trying to organize her thoughts enough to drive safely. She had her radio on the passenger seat, and she kept looking at it like it might speak again, might offer some explanation for what had happened. But it remained silent, just a small black device that looked completely ordinary and innocent. She drove to the nearest ranger station, maybe 40 minutes away, and when she got there, she sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes trying to decide what to say. The ranger she finally spoke to was a woman about her age who listened to Nicholas's story with an expression that shifted from polite attention to genuine concern. She asked detailed questions about the timing, the location, what exactly the voice had said. When Nicholas mentioned the radio and how it shouldn't have been able to receive a directed transmission, the ranger's expression changed again to something Nicholas couldn't quite read. The ranger asked to see the radio, examined it carefully, and confirmed what Nicholas already knew: receive only, no transmission capability, standard emergency radio carried by thousands of backcountry users. The ranger explained that emergency frequencies were monitored and logged by the Forest Service. Any transmission would create a record, especially something as unusual as a directed warning to a specific individual. She asked Nicholas to wait while she made some calls. The wait stretched to over an hour, during which Nicholas drank bad coffee and tried to process everything. When the ranger returned, her face was troubled. She told Nicholas that there had been no transmissions logged on emergency frequencies in that area last night. The monitoring systems had recorded nothing unusual, no broadcasts at all during the time frame Nicholas described, which meant either the equipment had failed, which the ranger said was unlikely given the redundancy of the systems, or the voice had somehow communicated through Nicholas's radio without using conventional transmission methods. Nicholas asked about the men, about whether anyone else had reported seeing people searching the forest in the middle of the night. The ranger said no reports had come in, but that she'd pass the information to law enforcement and to other stations in case there were suspicious activities in the area. She suggested Nicholas might want to speak to a doctor, not in a dismissive way, but out of genuine concern, noting that stress and altitude could sometimes cause auditory hallucinations. But Nicholas knew what she'd heard had been real. She had the memory of those men walking past her tent, the sound of their footsteps and voices. That part hadn't been a hallucination, which meant the warning had been real too, had given her information she'd needed to stay safe. She drove back to Boise that afternoon, the radio sitting in her passenger seat like an artifact from an experience she couldn't explain. Over the following days and weeks, she researched everything she could find about radio technology, about emergency communications, about unexplained transmissions, and mysterious warnings. She found stories scattered across forums and obscure websites of other people who'd received warnings or messages through devices that shouldn't have allowed such communication, but nothing definitive, nothing that provided real answers, just anecdotes and speculation, and the occasional suggestion that there were phenomena operating in wilderness areas that used our technology in ways we didn't understand. Nicholas tried using the radio on subsequent camping trips, kept it on and listened carefully, hoping it might speak again or provide some explanation, but it remained stubbornly normal, picking up only the standard weather broadcasts and emergency alerts it was designed for. Whatever had used it to warn her that night in July apparently had no further messages to convey. Or perhaps it only intervened when there was genuine danger, when someone needed protection they couldn't provide for themselves. She found that thought both comforting and deeply unsettling. The idea that something was watching out for people in the wilderness was reassuring in a way, but not knowing what that something was, what it wanted, why it chose to intervene, all of that sat uneasily with her need for rational explanations. The experience changed how she approached solo camping. She still goes, still loves the independence and solitude of backcountry travel, but she's more cautious now, more aware that the wilderness contains things that don't fit into neat categories of natural phenomena or human activity. She carries her radio on every trip, has it within reach when she sleeps, listens to it more carefully than she probably needs to. Part of her hopes to hear that voice again, to have another opportunity to understand what communicated with her, but a larger part hopes she never does, because hearing it again would mean she was in danger again, would mean something was watching, and had decided she needed another warning. She thinks about those men often, about what they were searching for and whether they ever found it. She wonders if they were criminals, or lost hikers, or something else entirely. The ranger never followed up with information, and Nicholas never pushed for it, somehow afraid that digging deeper would reveal things she wasn't ready to know. It's easier to leave it as an unexplained event, a night when something used impossible technology to keep her safe for reasons she'll never understand. That ambiguity is uncomfortable for someone with her background, someone trained to find clear causes and effects, to diagnose and solve problems. But some experiences she's learned resist resolution. They exist as permanent question marks, reminders that the world is stranger than our models of it account for. The radio sits on her gear shelf at home, charged and ready for her next trip. Sometimes late at night she turns it on, lets it scan through frequencies, while she does other things, half listening for that voice. It never comes, just static and occasional weather broadcasts and the normal chatter of emergency services going about their work. But once, on a trip last fall, she thought she heard something. Not words exactly, but a pattern in the static that felt intentional, like someone trying to communicate but unable to form clear sounds. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then it was gone, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined it, or if whatever had warned her was still out there, still watching, still occasionally reaching out through technology it shouldn't be able to access. She's told very few people about this. Her professional reputation matters, and stories about mysterious radio voices don't align well with the image of competence and rationality that paramedics need to maintain. But with close friends, with people she trusts, she sometimes shares it. And more often than she'd expected, they have their own stories. Not about radios necessarily, but about moments in the wilderness when they received help or information from sources they couldn't identify, when something intervened to keep them safe in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It's made her wonder how common these experiences actually are, how many people carry similar stories but keep them quiet because they don't fit into acceptable frameworks of explanation. Nicholas still camps solo, still ventures into remote areas with just her gear and her training and her emergency radio, but she does it with the awareness that she's not always as alone as she appears to be. Something out there is paying attention, something with the capability to access technology in impossible ways, with knowledge of both her location and approaching threats, with what seems like a protective intent, even as its nature remains completely mysterious. She's grateful for the warning that night, grateful she trusted it and turned off her light and stayed hidden. But the gratitude is complicated by all the unanswered questions, by the fundamental strangeness of being watched over by something she can't see or understand. Still, when she clips that radio to her pack before each trip, she feels a sense of security that goes beyond its technical capabilities. Whether rational or not, she believes that if she's ever in real danger again, if there's ever another night when men with flashlights are searching for something they shouldn't find, that voice will return, will warn her, will give her the information she needs to survive. And that belief, however impossible its foundation, has become part of how she moves through wilderness, a strange faith in protection from an unknown source that communicates through devices that shouldn't allow communication at all. If you heard a voice through a device that couldn't transmit, warning you of danger that turned out to be real, would you trust it or think you were losing your mind? Have you ever been warned of something by a source you couldn't explain? Share below. Alejandro had always been meticulous about planning, the kind of person who kept detailed spreadsheets for even casual weekend trips. At 41, he'd developed systems for everything in his life, from his work as an accountant to his outdoor hobbies. So when he planned a solo camping trip to Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania for an October weekend, he approached it with his usual attention to detail. He'd mapped his route, checked weather forecasts, packed precisely what he needed and nothing more. His wife knew his itinerary, knew he was leaving Friday afternoon and would be back Sunday evening. He'd even sent her photos of his gear laid out before packing, a habit he'd developed so she'd know exactly what he had with him in case of emergency. Everything was organized, planned, accounted for. The drive to the forest took about 3 hours from his home outside Pittsburgh, and he arrived at the trailhead around 4 on Friday afternoon, with plenty of daylight left to hike to his chosen campsite. The October weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with trees showing the last of their fall colors against a clear blue sky. He felt good as he started hiking, felt the familiar loosening of tension that came from leaving behind emails and spreadsheets and client demands. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through mixed hardwood forest that was beautiful even as it prepared for winter dormancy. He reached his campsite by 6, set up his tent with practiced efficiency, and had dinner cooking by 7. Everything was going exactly according to plan. He spent the evening reading by headlamp, something he'd been looking forward to all week. At home, there were always distractions, always something demanding his attention. Out here, he could focus completely on the book in his hands, could lose himself in someone else's story, while the forest settled into darkness around him. He finished several chapters, checked that his site was properly secured for the night, and climbed into his sleeping bag around 10, feeling satisfied with how the trip was starting. He fell asleep quickly, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone physically tired and mentally at ease. When he woke, something felt wrong immediately. The light coming through his tent was too bright, the angle too high for early morning. He checked his watch and felt a jolt of confusion. It read 9:15, which was much later than he usually slept while camping. He always woke with first light, a pattern so consistent he rarely needed an alarm. But apparently, he'd slept through dawn and well into morning without stirring once. He felt groggy and disoriented as he climbed out of his sleeping bag and emerged from his tent into bright sunshine. His campsite looked exactly as he'd left it, fire ring cold, gear where he'd placed it. Everything normal except for the lost hours of sleep. He made coffee and breakfast, trying to shake the fog in his head. Maybe he'd been more tired. Then he realized. The work week had been demanding. Lots of late nights finishing quarterly reports. Perhaps his body had just needed the extra rest. He spent the morning hiking, exploring trails near his campsite, taking photos of the forest in its autumn transformation. By afternoon, he felt better, more like himself, and decided to make an early dinner before sunset. He wanted to enjoy the evening light, maybe do more reading, turn in early, and get a full night's sleep before hiking out Sunday morning. But when he checked his phone to take a photo of the sunset, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The date was wrong. His phone said it was Wednesday. Not Sunday, but Wednesday. He stared at the screen, certain it had to be a glitch. He'd arrived Friday, slept one night, and woken up Saturday morning. Today was Saturday. It had to be. But his phone insisted it was Wednesday, and when he checked his watch, it showed the same date. Wednesday, October 18th. 5 days after he'd arrived at this campsite. Alejandro sat down heavily on a log, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This had to be a technical error, both devices somehow updating to the wrong date. Except his phone also showed a battery level that matched 5 days of occasional use. And his watch, which wasn't connected to any network, showed the same date progression. He looked around his campsite with new eyes, trying to find evidence that he'd been here for days instead of one night. His water supply was lower than it should be. His food showed consumption consistent with several days of meals. He ran a hand over his jaw and felt several days of beard growth, thick and rough in a way that didn't match overnight stubble. The realization hit him like physical impact. He'd lost time. Somehow, impossibly, he'd lost 4 entire days. He had no memory of Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. Nothing between falling asleep Friday night and waking up what he thought was Saturday morning, but was actually Wednesday. His mind raced through explanations, each more disturbing than the last. Had he been unconscious, injured? But he felt fine, no pain or injuries, no signs of trauma. Had he been sleepwalking, going through the motions of camping while unconscious? That didn't explain the missing memories or the normal state of his campsite. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands and scrolled through his activity. There were text messages he didn't remember sending. His wife had texted him Sunday asking if he was having fun, and he'd apparently responded that everything was great. Monday, she'd sent a reminder about a dentist appointment on Thursday, and he'd replied that he'd be back in time. Tuesday, she'd texted a photo of their dog, and he'd sent back a heart emoji. The messages were right there, time-stamped and sent from his phone. He'd had entire text conversations over the past several days that he had absolutely no memory of conducting. His photo gallery showed more evidence of the missing time. Dozens of photos taken over the past few days, images of the forest from different times of day, pictures of his meals, a selfie from what the timestamp said was Monday afternoon. He looked at that selfie carefully, studying his own face for any sign that something was wrong. But he looked normal, relaxed even, smiling slightly at the camera. Whatever had been happening during those missing days, the version of him that existed then had seemed fine, had carried on normally, texting his wife, taking photos, apparently going about a camping trip without any awareness that something was deeply wrong. Alejandro pulled up his phone's location history, something he kept activated for safety reasons. The data made him feel sick. Over the past 4 days, his phone had traveled to 3 different state forests, each several hours' drive from where he was now. On Sunday, his location showed him at a forest in western Maryland. Monday, he'd been in southern Ohio. Tuesday, his phone had tracked him to somewhere in West Virginia. And apparently, at some point Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, he'd driven back here to Pennsylvania and returned to his original campsite. His truck was parked at the trailhead, where he'd left it Friday. He was certain of that. Which meant he'd driven hundreds of miles over several days, visiting multiple forests, and had absolutely no memory of any of it. He packed up his campsite with mechanical efficiency, his accountant's brain trying to organize information that refused to be organized. He needed to get home, needed to see a doctor, needed to understand what had happened to him. The hike back to the trailhead felt surreal, every step taking him through a forest that suddenly felt alien and threatening. When he reached his truck, he examined it carefully before getting in. The odometer showed he'd driven almost 600 miles since Friday. The gas tank was half empty. There were receipts in the cup holder from gas stations he didn't remember visiting, dated Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. The drive home was one of the most difficult things he'd ever done. He kept checking the date on his dashboard display, kept confirming that it really was Wednesday, that he really had lost 4 days of his life to actions he couldn't remember. When he finally pulled into his driveway, his wife came out to meet him with a smile that faded immediately when she saw his face. She asked what was wrong, and he tried to explain, tried to tell her that he didn't remember the past 4 days, that he'd thought it was Saturday when it was actually Wednesday, that he had no memory of sending her texts or taking photos or driving to 3 other states. Her confusion and concern were evident, but there was also something else in her expression. A wariness, like she was trying to determine if he was joking or having some kind of breakdown. She showed him their text conversations, the casual back and forth they'd maintained all weekend. She said he'd seemed fine in his messages, normal and relaxed. She'd had no indication anything was wrong. When he insisted he didn't remember sending those texts, didn't remember any of the past few days, she suggested he sit down and rest. Maybe he was dehydrated, or had gotten a concussion somehow. But Alejandro knew this wasn't dehydration or a head injury. He made an appointment with his doctor for the next day and spent Wednesday evening going through all the evidence of his missing time. The photos on his phone showed him at different trailheads, different forests, different campsites. In each location, he appeared relaxed and normal, someone enjoying a solo camping trip across multiple states. There were photos of meals he'd cooked, of scenic views he'd photographed, of his tent set up in different locations. All of it documented, all of it showing him going through the motions of a camping trip he had absolutely no memory of experiencing. The medical tests showed nothing. His doctor ordered blood work, neurological exams, everything she could think of to explain a sudden loss of memory spanning multiple days. But every test came back normal. No signs of stroke, no evidence of seizures, no indication of any medical event that would cause this kind of amnesia. His doctor referred him to a neurologist who did more tests and found the same thing. Nothing. Physically, Alejandro was completely healthy. Mentally, he'd lost 4 days of his life with no medical explanation for the gap. He returned to the locations his phone said he'd visited, driving to each of the 3 forests over the following weeks. He talked to rangers at each site, asking if they remembered seeing him, if anything unusual had been reported during the dates he was there. Nobody remembered him specifically, though the rangers acknowledged that solo campers were common enough that one person wouldn't necessarily stand out. He hiked some of the trails his GPS history suggested he'd taken, looking for anything that might trigger a memory or provide a clue, but nothing came back. The missing days remained missing. What disturbed him most was the evidence that during those lost days, he'd functioned normally. He'd driven safely across multiple states, had set up and broken down camp repeatedly, had texted his wife coherent messages, had taken thoughtful photographs. Whatever had happened to him, it hadn't left him incapacitated or confused. The version of him that existed during those 4 days had been competent and aware, just not the version he remembered being. It was like he'd been replaced by someone who looked like him, acted like him, carried on his life while the conscious part of him was simply absent. And then, just as mysteriously, that other version had returned him to his original campsite and disappeared, leaving him to wake up Wednesday morning thinking it was Saturday and having to discover the missing time on his own. He tried talking to people in online forums, looking for others who'd experienced similar missing time events. He found stories, more than he'd expected. People who'd gone camping or hiking and lost hours or days, who discovered evidence of activities they couldn't remember, who'd somehow continued functioning normally during periods they couldn't account for. The stories were scattered and anecdotal, impossible to verify or investigate properly. But the similarities were striking. Many mentioned feeling watched before the missing time began. Several described waking up thinking less time had passed than actually had. Almost all of them had some kind of documentation proving they'd been active during the period they couldn't remember. Alejandro still camps occasionally, though never alone and never overnight. Day hikes with friends, casual trips that keep him close to civilization and other people. The solo backcountry experiences he used to love now feel too risky, too vulnerable. He's afraid of losing time again, afraid of waking up to discover days or weeks have passed while some other version of himself went through the motions of his life. His wife is supportive but clearly worried, watching him more carefully than she used to, asking more questions about where he's going and when he'll be back. He can't blame her. He watches himself more carefully too, documenting his days meticulously, keeping careful track of time passing, alert for any sign that another gap might be opening. The hardest part is the not knowing. If he understood what had happened, if there was a medical diagnosis or a rational explanation, he could potentially address it, or at least prepare for it happening again. But there's nothing. Just 4 missing days that his phone and watch and body confirm happened, but that his conscious mind never experienced. He looks at the photos from those days sometimes, studying his own face for clues. He looks happy, relaxed, like someone genuinely enjoying a camping trip across multiple states. And that might be the most unsettling thing of all. Whatever was controlling him during those missing days, whatever had taken over his actions and decisions, it had made him appear content, had taken him to beautiful places, had maintained his routines and relationships, had carried on his life in a way that looked completely normal from the outside. He wonders sometimes if it will happen again, if this was a one-time event or the first instance of something that will recur. He's hyper-aware of his own continuity of consciousness now, constantly checking in with himself to confirm he knows what day it is, where he is, what he's been doing. His wife jokes that he's developed obsessive tendencies, the way he checks his phone's date display multiple times a day, the way he keeps detailed journals of his activities. But it doesn't feel obsessive to him. It feels necessary. He lost 4 days once without realizing it, and if it happens again, he wants to catch it as quickly as possible. Wants to minimize the gap between the person he is and the person who apparently takes over when he's absent. The photos from those missing days are still on his phone. He can't bring himself to delete them, even though looking at them makes him uncomfortable. They're evidence of a version of himself he doesn't remember being, documentation of experiences that should be his, but that exist only as digital artifacts rather than actual memories. Sometimes he shows them to his wife, asks her if the person in those photos looks like him, acts like him, seems like the person she knows. She always says yes, that he looks exactly like himself in the images. But Alejandro knows better. The person in those photos may have his face and his body and his mannerisms, but it wasn't him. Not the him that's looking at the photos now, trying to understand what happened during those 4 October days when he apparently drove across 3 states, camped in 4 different forests, and went about a normal trip while his conscious self was simply gone. Thanks for watching this collection of true camping experiences that challenge everything we think we know about wilderness and reality. These aren't just campfire tales meant to entertain. They're genuine accounts from real people who encountered things that shouldn't exist. If these stories affected you, if they made you question what might be out there in the forests and mountains we think we understand, then subscribe to Bleak Fears. We'll continue exploring the darkest and strangest corners of human experience, bringing you stories that are documented, verified, and absolutely true. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we can see.